When moonless winds scour forgotten ruins, 3 hours of Sumerian's most strange and haunting mysteries descends through shattered temples where oath-bound priests buried trembling truths. Dead rivers whisper, celestial omens bleed, and beneath cracked clay, an impossible memory still watches. Beneath the quiet, sun-baked plains of southern Mesopotamia lies Eridu, one of the world's earliest known cities. Today, the ruins are little more than low mounds of mud brick and scattered fragments of pottery. Yet archaeologists speak of Eridu as the cradle of civilization, a place where humans first began to build temples to gods, to shape clay into written records, and to imagine societies beyond the village. But beneath these familiar layers of ancient settlement, there exists a mystery that continues to baffle historians and archaeologists alike. A burned layer, a stratum of charred debris and ash, embedded deep in the earth, predating much of what we thought we understood about Eridu's earliest phases. The burned layer is not subtle. Excavations reveal thick, blackened soil, fractured mud brick, and fragments of charred wood. Radiocarbon dating places this destruction at a time before the great urbanization of Sumer, thousands of years BC. Yet the cause of the burning remains elusive. Was it the result of human conflict, perhaps a forgotten war between early city-states, or a domestic accident, the fire of a temple or workshop gone out of control? Some evidence suggests widespread devastation, affecting large portions of the settlement simultaneously, hinting at a more catastrophic event than ordinary human error. Archaeologists have long debated the origins of this layer. Traditional interpretations lean toward warfare or accidental fire, an early city consumed by its own human ambitions. But there are peculiar details that make these explanations feel incomplete. Some pottery shards display thermal fractures inconsistent with ordinary conflagration. Certain mud bricks appear vitrified, as if exposed to an extreme, almost furnace-like heat. Even more intriguingly, traces of melted materials hint at temperatures far beyond what a conventional fire could achieve in a mud brick structure. Could this have been a natural event? A lightning strike, perhaps? Or a rare geological phenomenon? Or was there something more extraordinary at play? Something beyond the realm of typical historical or scientific reasoning? Scholars examining the layer have noted that it coincides with a broader pattern of unexplained destruction across the region. Sites in southern Mesopotamia, and even farther north, show similar charred layers, sometimes separated by centuries, sometimes almost contemporaneous. What could have triggered such widespread events? Climatic shifts, perhaps, a sudden drought or heat wave that made early settlements vulnerable to fire? Or could there be forces we have yet to comprehend? Forces that intersected the human and natural worlds in ways we can only speculate about? Among the fragments, small artifacts seem oddly preserved. Tiny clay figurines, broken tools, and inscribed tablets bear marks of scorching but remain recognizable, as though frozen in the instant of disaster. Each shard raises more questions. What did these people know? What were they doing at the moment the fire consumed their homes and temples? And why has the evidence been preserved in such a way that even thousands of years later, we can feel the heat of an ancient flame in our imagination? Some fringe theories hint at cosmic causes, asteroidal impacts, or even the passing of celestial phenomena capable of generating immense heat. These ideas are speculative, of course, yet they emerge precisely because the conventional explanations leave gaps too significant to ignore. And perhaps it is within those gaps, between the certainty of archaeology and the vast unknown of deep time, that the true mystery of Eridu's burned layer lies. As the archaeologists brush away millennia of sand, we are left with the silence of a city that once thrived, and then, suddenly, burned. The charred layer is not just evidence of destruction. It is a reminder of the fragility of human endeavor and of how much of the past remains hidden beneath the earth, waiting for careful eyes and patient hands. What ignited this fire? Why does it appear in such a precise stratum, so deep and so widespread? And what might the next excavation reveal about this earliest chapter of human civilization? For now, the burned layer beneath Eridu remains an enigma. Its secrets are buried in ash and soil, whispering across the millennia. And as we peer into these charred depths, we are reminded that even the earliest cities, built by hands now long gone, can still speak to us, if only we listen closely enough. If the burned layer beneath Eridu reminds us how much of the ancient world can vanish beneath ash, then the next mystery reveals something perhaps even more unsettling: the disappearance not of buildings, but of knowledge itself. Far to the north of Eridu, rising from the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, stood the great city of Uruk. Today, its ruined walls and weathered foundations emerge from the desert like fragments of a forgotten dream. Yet more than 5,000 years ago, Uruk was one of the most influential cities on Earth, a place of monumental architecture, organized government, and some of humanity's earliest known writing. At the heart of this vast urban center stood the Eanna precinct, a sacred complex dedicated primarily to Eanna, one of the most important deities in the Sumerian world. The Eanna was not merely a religious center. It functioned as an administrative hub, an economic institution, and a repository of information. Here, scribes pressed symbols into wet clay tablets, recording transactions, offerings, inventories, land holdings, and perhaps much more. And yet, despite the immense importance of the site, a puzzling absence remains. The archives that should have accompanied centuries of activity within the Eanna precinct are, in many respects, missing. Archaeologists excavating Uruk uncovered thousands of clay tablets dating from various periods. These discoveries have provided invaluable insights into the development of writing and the organization of early urban life. However, when researchers began examining the administrative history of the Eanna complex itself, they encountered unexpected gaps. Entire periods appear underrepresented. Records that one might expect to survive in large quantities are strangely scarce. Some archives seem fragmented, while others appear to have vanished altogether. Where did they go? The question may sound simple, but the answer has proven remarkably elusive. One explanation is entirely practical. Clay tablets survive only under specific conditions. Many archives throughout Mesopotamia endured because buildings collapsed and sealed documents beneath layers of debris. Others survived because accidental fires baked the clay into a more durable form. If archives at Eanna were stored in structures that decayed gradually, countless records may simply have dissolved back into the earth over thousands of years. It is a reasonable explanation, and one accepted by many scholars. Yet certain details continue to raise questions. The Eanna precinct operated for centuries as one of the most important administrative centers in southern Mesopotamia. Vast amounts of economic activity passed through its institutions. Temple administrators managed agricultural production, livestock, trade goods, labor forces, and religious offerings. Such a system would almost certainly have generated enormous quantities of documentation. If so much was recorded, why do surviving archives appear so incomplete? Some researchers suggest that many tablets may still remain undiscovered beneath unexcavated sections of the site. Uruk covers an immense area, and only portions have been thoroughly investigated. Beneath layers of sediment, collapsed architecture, and centuries of accumulated debris, entire archive rooms may still lie hidden. Others point toward the turbulent history of the city itself. Throughout its long existence, Uruk experienced political transitions, dynastic changes, foreign invasions, and shifting religious priorities. During such periods, archives were sometimes relocated, reorganized, or intentionally destroyed. Documents that no longer served administrative purposes might have been recycled. Clay tablets could be broken down, reworked, or discarded. New rulers often sought to reshape historical narratives, emphasizing some traditions while allowing others to fade into obscurity. Could portions of the Eanna archives have been deliberately removed? The possibility cannot be entirely dismissed. Ancient texts themselves hint at the immense significance of written knowledge. Scribes occupied prestigious positions within Mesopotamian society. Literacy was limited, and written records carried authority. Control over archives often meant control over resources, legitimacy, and memory itself. In a world where power and information were closely linked, preserving certain records and concealing others may have carried profound consequences. Then there are the more speculative interpretations. Some independent researchers have proposed that the missing archives may have contained categories of information rarely preserved elsewhere. Beyond inventories and administrative accounts, temple complexes often housed religious texts, astronomical observations, ritual instructions, and royal correspondence. If substantial portions of such records disappeared, entire chapters of Sumerian intellectual history may have vanished with them. This idea has inspired a range of theories. Some suggest that forgotten archives could contain descriptions of celestial events no longer remembered. Others speculate about lost traditions, vanished mythological narratives, or historical accounts that might challenge conventional understandings of the ancient world. A few even wonder whether certain knowledge was intentionally hidden, preserved in secret repositories known only to select priesthoods. There is little direct evidence for such claims, yet the absence itself continues to invite speculation. Ancient Mesopotamian literature frequently portrays temples as places where divine wisdom intersected with human affairs. The gods were believed to possess knowledge inaccessible to ordinary people. Priests and scribes served as intermediaries, recording sacred traditions and interpreting signs believed to originate from the heavens. Against that backdrop, the notion of lost archives takes on a different dimension. What if some records were never meant to be widely circulated? What if certain texts remained restricted, copied only in limited numbers, vulnerable to disappearance through the passage of time? Or what if the missing documents were entirely ordinary, their absence simply the result of preservation's unpredictable nature? The challenge is that both possibilities can coexist. Archaeology often reveals as much through what is missing as through what is found. Walking through the ruins of Eanna today, it is difficult to imagine the activity that once filled these courtyards. Administrators reviewed accounts. Priests conducted ceremonies. Scribes sat cross-legged beside baskets of clay, pressing wedge-shaped symbols into tablets that captured the daily rhythm of one of humanity's earliest cities. Most of those voices have fallen silent. A handful remain preserved in museums and research collections around the world, offering brief glimpses into a civilization that helped shape the foundations of urban life. But countless others may be gone forever, or perhaps still buried beneath the sands, waiting for discovery. And so the mystery endures. Somewhere between what has survived and what has vanished lies an invisible archive, a shadow record of Uruk's past. Whether lost through accident, destruction, deliberate concealment, or simple chance, the missing temple archives of Eanna leave behind an unsettling question. How much of humanity's earliest written memory has disappeared beyond recovery, and what stories might still be hidden beneath the ancient soil of Uruk? If the missing archives of Eanna leave us wondering how much knowledge has been lost to time, the next mystery invites us to consider something even more tangible: hidden spaces concealed beneath the earth itself. For in the ancient city of Nippur, one of the most sacred centers of Sumerian civilization, archaeologists have encountered hints of structures that seem to belong to a world below the city rather than above it. The ruins of Nippur rise gently from the Mesopotamian plain, their weathered mounds blending almost seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. At first glance, there is little to suggest that this quiet archaeological site was once among the most revered cities in southern Mesopotamia. Unlike Uruk, which was famous for its political influence and urban scale, Nippur occupied a unique position. It was regarded as the spiritual heart of Sumer, the sacred city of Enlil, one of the most powerful deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. For thousands of years, kings traveled to Nippur seeking legitimacy. Conquerors who ruled distant territories often considered recognition from Nippur's priesthood essential to their authority. At the center of this sacred landscape stood the Ikur, the great temple complex dedicated to Enlil. Yet beneath the visible remains of temples, courtyards, and ceremonial structures lies a mystery that continues to provoke curiosity. Scattered excavation reports, architectural anomalies, and references from early archaeological investigations have pointed to the existence of underground chambers, tunnels, and subsurface spaces beneath portions of the ancient city. Some of these features were documented. Others were only briefly mentioned before disappearing into the fragmented records of early excavations. What exactly lies beneath Nippur? The answer remains uncertain. Archaeological work at the site began in the 19th century and continued intermittently throughout the 20th century. Over the decades, researchers uncovered temples, administrative buildings, libraries, and residential districts. Among these discoveries were references to underground rooms and buried architectural features whose functions were not immediately understood. Some were relatively small chambers constructed below floor level. Others appeared connected to deeper foundations or enclosed spaces that extended beyond excavated areas. In several cases, excavation notes suggest that certain subterranean features were difficult to fully investigate due to flooding, unstable soil conditions, or limitations in excavation technology. To many archaeologists, these structures are not especially mysterious. Ancient Mesopotamian cities often included underground elements. Storage rooms, foundation deposits, drainage systems, ritual chambers, and crypt-like spaces have been identified at numerous sites. Given Nippur's long history of occupation, it would be entirely expected for later construction phases to overlap with earlier buried structures, creating a complex maze beneath the visible city. This explanation accounts for much of the evidence. And yet, questions remain. Nippur was not merely another urban center. It was a place infused with religious significance. Sumerian texts describe the city as a point of connection between heaven and earth. The Akur temple was viewed as a cosmic center, a place where divine authority entered the human world. Such beliefs naturally raise intriguing possibilities regarding the purpose of underground spaces associated with sacred architecture. Could some chambers have served ritual functions now forgotten? Throughout the ancient world, subterranean spaces often carried symbolic meaning. Darkness, depth, and enclosure were frequently associated with transformation, initiation, communication with divine forces, or journeys into realms beyond ordinary human experience. Mesopotamian literature contains numerous references to the underworld, known by various names in different periods. These descriptions portray hidden realms beneath the earth where gods, spirits, and the dead resided. While there is no direct evidence linking Nippur's underground chambers to such beliefs, the symbolic connection has not gone unnoticed by researchers. Some scholars suggest that certain subsurface rooms may have played roles in temple rituals that are poorly documented in surviving texts. Ceremonies involving sacred objects, restricted priestly activities, or symbolic reenactments could potentially have required secluded spaces shielded from public view. Unfortunately, the archaeological evidence is often incomplete. Many of the earliest excavations occurred before modern recording standards existed. Details that would be meticulously documented today were sometimes summarized briefly or omitted entirely. As a result, some reported underground features remain frustratingly difficult to reconstruct. This uncertainty has allowed more speculative interpretations to emerge. Independent researchers have occasionally proposed that extensive tunnel networks once connected major structures throughout Nippur. According to these theories, hidden passageways may have allowed priests to move unseen beneath the temple complex or transport sacred objects during religious ceremonies. Others have suggested that unexplored chambers may still exist beneath the site, sealed and untouched for thousands of years. Ground-penetrating surveys conducted at various archaeological locations around the world have repeatedly revealed previously unknown structures beneath ancient settlements. Could Nippur still conceal entire rooms beyond the reach of earlier excavations? The possibility remains open. More imaginative theories go further still. Some point to ancient traditions describing secret knowledge preserved within sacred centers. In these interpretations, underground chambers served as repositories for restricted texts, ritual objects, or teachings reserved for a select priesthood. A few researchers even speculate that unexplored spaces beneath Nippur may contain archives comparable to those missing from other Sumerian sites. There is currently no evidence to support such claims. Yet neither can every buried structure beneath Nippur be confidently identified. The city itself adds to the mystery. Built, rebuilt, and expanded across thousands of years, Nippur became a layered landscape in which each generation constructed its world atop the remains of those who came before. Temples rose over earlier temples. Walls enclosed older walls. Streets crossed forgotten foundations. Over time, entire sections of the city disappeared beneath accumulating layers of mud brick and sediment. What began as a surface structure could eventually become an underground chamber simply through the passage of centuries. Standing on the windswept mounds today, it is difficult to grasp the immense depth of history concealed beneath one's feet. Below the exposed ruins lies a vast archaeological archive, much of it still unexcavated. Hidden walls, buried rooms, and forgotten foundations remain locked within the earth, preserving fragments of stories that have yet to be told. Perhaps the unidentified chambers beneath Nippur are nothing more than ordinary architectural features awaiting clearer interpretation. Or perhaps they represent pieces of a sacred landscape whose deeper meaning has been lost with the passing of millennia. For now, the darkness beneath the ancient city keeps its secrets. And as archaeologists continue their work above ground, one question quietly endures below it. How many hidden spaces still lie beneath Nippur, untouched and unseen, waiting for someone to uncover what they were truly built for? If the hidden chambers of Nippur hint at spaces and knowledge deliberately concealed beneath the earth, then the next mystery shifts our focus from the depths of the soil to the very walls of Sumer's earliest temples, where strange symbols etched into clay and stone have puzzled scholars for generations. Across the plains of southern Mesopotamia, in sites such as Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, archaeologists have uncovered mosaics composed of small clay cones, carefully embedded into walls, floors, and sacred altars. At first glance, these arrangements appear purely decorative: geometric patterns, radiating circles, spirals, and intricate grids that suggest aesthetic intention. Yet the more closely these cones are examined, the more enigmatic they become. Their placement is deliberate, their shapes often uniform, and the symbols they form, though abstract, seem to carry meaning beyond simple ornamentation. The earliest examples date back to around 3100 BC, in temples that were already functioning as centers of religious, social, and administrative power. Sumerians placed immense emphasis on ritual and symbolism. Every architectural choice could be a reflection of cosmology, mythology, or the perceived will of the gods. Yet despite decades of study, the exact purpose of these cone mosaics remains uncertain. Conventional interpretations suggest practical or symbolic functions. Some scholars propose that the cones were offerings, perhaps representing seeds, grains, or miniature votive objects pressed into the walls as a sign of devotion. Others see the patterns as protective devices, intended to safeguard the temple and its inhabitants from spiritual harm. A recurring theory points to numerology. The number of cones, their arrangement in repeated motifs, and their alignment with architectural features may correspond to celestial cycles, agricultural calendars, or other measurements vital to Sumerian life. While these explanations provide plausible context, they leave lingering questions. Why do certain symbols appear only in specific temples? Why are some patterns meticulously repeated, while others seem chaotic, almost experimental? Why did the Sumerians choose cones as a medium rather than carving directly into the stone or mud brick? Adding to the mystery, some mosaics display abstract symbols that defy easy categorization. Spirals that could represent water, radiating circles resembling stars, and clustered points that hint at constellations appear alongside forms that have no known analogues in Sumerian iconography. Were these purely artistic inventions, or did they encode knowledge lost to time? Some researchers have even noted similarities between these cone arrangements and later astral symbols, suggesting that Sumerians may have recorded observations of the heavens in a visual language now largely indecipherable. The placement of the cones is equally intriguing. In certain temples, entire walls are adorned with these mosaics, while in others they are confined to altars, doorways, or inner sanctuaries. The careful selection of locations raises questions about access. Were these symbols meant to be seen by all worshippers, or only by priests performing sacred rituals? Could they have served as mnemonic devices, helping initiate members recall stories, prayers, or complex cosmological frameworks? Beyond these practical and symbolic interpretations, a more speculative line of inquiry has emerged. Independent researchers have suggested that some cone mosaics might be representations of objects or phenomena unfamiliar to modern observers. Could these patterns encode knowledge of distant landscapes, rare astronomical events, or even principles of engineering or mathematics that are only partially understood today? Others posit that the mosaics may reflect a proto-writing system, a symbolic language preceding the cuneiform tablets that would later dominate Sumerian record-keeping. While no consensus exists, the possibility lingers. These humble cones may be more than decoration. They could be remnants of a sophisticated semiotic system whose meaning has been lost over millennia. The materials themselves are worth noting. Cones were typically fashioned from clay, sometimes colored, and occasionally fired to increase durability. Their very creation required labor, precision, and careful selection of materials. Even if their purpose was symbolic, the investment of time and resources implies significance beyond the superficial. In a society where monumental effort was reserved for the sacred or politically essential, the cone mosaics were likely more than idle artistry. There are also hints that the cone mosaics may connect across sites. Scholars have observed patterns repeated in distant cities, suggesting that certain arrangements may have carried standardized meaning, understood across regions, or transmitted via priestly networks. If so, these mosaics represent an early form of communication, bridging geography and time, encoded not in words but in shapes and arrangements. And yet, despite careful study, the mystery endures. The motifs resist definitive translation. Some appear purely aesthetic, some functional, some perhaps sacred, and others inscrutable. Walking through the ruins of a Sumerian temple today, one can almost sense the deliberate care in each embedded cone, the quiet assertion that these tiny conical forms were more than decoration. They were messages, prayers, or records, embedded in walls that have endured millennia. As we examine the strange cone mosaics of early Sumerian temples, we are left with a profound question. What knowledge, beliefs, or memories did these simple shapes encode, and how much of that meaning has been irrevocably lost? In their silent geometric language, the cones speak of a civilization deeply attuned to both the physical and spiritual world, a civilization whose secrets continue to invite investigation, interpretation, and wonder. Even today, standing before walls adorned with these enigmatic mosaics, it is impossible not to feel a sense of reverence for the unknown. What stories, what wisdom, what mysteries do these tiny cones conceal, waiting for a patient eye to uncover their hidden significance? If the cone mosaics of Sumerian temples hint at hidden knowledge encoded in plain sight, then the next mystery leads us beyond stone and clay into a space once alive with vegetation, ritual, and reverence, a sacred grove that seems to have vanished almost entirely from both the landscape and the record. The city of Girsu, later integrated into the greater urban center of Lagash, was home to one of Sumer's most revered deities, Ningirsu, god of war, agriculture, and protection. Ancient texts speak repeatedly of a sacred grove, a consecrated forest surrounding Ningirsu's temple, filled with trees, gardens, and natural spaces dedicated to divine worship. In Mesopotamian culture, sacred groves were not mere decoration. They were living temples, spaces where the divine intersected with the earthly, where rituals could be performed beneath canopies of leaves, and where offerings could be made in the quiet of shaded corridors. Archaeologists and historians, guided by these textual references, have long searched for evidence of this grove. Excavations of Girsu have uncovered temples, ziggurats, and surrounding administrative structures, but traces of the once celebrated forest are curiously absent. Pollen analysis and soil studies indicate cultivated land, gardens, and some orchards, but the dense grove described in Sumerian inscriptions, trees of significant height, sacred flora, and ritual pathways, leaves little archaeological footprint. Its disappearance is striking. How could an area so central to the spiritual life of Girsu vanish so completely? Mainstream explanations offer practical interpretations. Sumerian cities expanded over centuries, their landscapes reshaped by urbanization, irrigation, and agriculture. Trees may have been cleared to make way for new temples, workshops, or city streets. Environmental changes, shifts in water tables, soil salinity, or prolonged drought may have made the grove unsustainable. Human activity combined with natural processes could have erased most traces, leaving only faint hints in the archaeological record. Yet certain details resist purely practical explanations. Inscriptions and ritual texts emphasize the grove's sacredness and longevity, suggesting it was maintained and protected across generations. Ancient records describe processions through shaded avenues, ceremonial offerings beneath specific trees, and even accounts of divine presence manifesting within the grove. Such attention implies intentional preservation. If the grove was so meticulously cared for, why is there almost no physical evidence of its continued existence after the early dynastic period? Some researchers propose that the sacred grove may have been intentionally relocated or symbolically represented. Temple priests could have reconstructed it elsewhere within the complex or maintained miniature groves within courtyards. Clay figurines, carved reliefs, and cone mosaics depicting trees and vegetation may have served as surrogate representations of the original sacred space. But if so, why do ancient texts distinguish so clearly between the living grove and other symbolic gardens? The distinction suggests that a real, tangible grove once existed, not merely symbolic representations. Other theories push further into the unknown. Some suggest that the grove could have been destroyed in cataclysmic events, flooding, fire, or conflict, leaving almost no trace. Early Sumerian cities were not immune to environmental and social upheaval. Could a single, sudden disaster have wiped out a sacred space that had endured for centuries? Some independent researchers speculate about seismic activity, river course changes, or localized ecological collapse as potential causes. Evidence for such events is sparse, but the possibility remains. Even more speculative interpretations connect the grove's disappearance to Sumerian cosmology. The texts describe the grove as a liminal space, a place where the divine world touched the human realm. Was it perhaps a site of extraordinary ritual significance whose very existence made it vulnerable to concealment or transformation over time? Could portions of the grove have been intentionally destroyed, relocated, or hidden to preserve its sanctity or protect its secrets from desecration? These suggestions are difficult to substantiate, yet the consistency of references to the grove across centuries hints at a mystery deeper than urban planning alone. Archaeological evidence continues to tease the imagination. Soil samples show anomalies that may indicate past vegetation patterns. Reliefs from nearby temples depict stylized trees, which some scholars interpret as memory of the grove's layout. Even ritual texts referencing seasonal offerings or divine manifestations may encode information about the grove's original dimensions, species composition, and sacred pathways. But translating these fragments into a coherent reconstruction remains elusive. As with many Sumerian mysteries, the disappearance of the sacred grove challenges our understanding of the interplay between human culture, environment, and the divine. Was the grove lost because of practical necessity, environmental shifts, or deliberate human intervention? Or was it, in some sense, removed from the physical world, preserved only in memory, ritual, and text? Walking among the ruins of Girsu today, it is easy to imagine the grove as it once was, sunlight filtering through dense foliage, priests and worshippers moving quietly beneath the trees, offerings placed along shaded pathways, and the presence of Ningirsu felt in every leaf and shadow. And yet, for all the care taken to maintain it for centuries, the grove has vanished from sight, leaving only tantalizing traces and haunting questions. What secrets, then, remain buried beneath the sands and sediments of Girsu? How much of the Sumerian spiritual landscape, the spaces where humans once interacted directly with the divine, has been erased, transformed, or hidden from view? And perhaps most compelling of all, could the sacred grove of Ningirsu still exist in ways we cannot yet recognize, waiting for patient eyes and careful excavation to rediscover a space where the divine and the natural once converged? In pondering its disappearance, we are reminded that not all of history is written in stone or clay. Some of it lives only in absence, in spaces and structures that have vanished, yet continue to speak through the echoes they leave behind. If the sacred grove of Ningirsu reminds us that entire landscapes of worship can vanish without leaving a trace, then the next mystery draws us inward once more, into the silent gaze of objects that were never meant to be understood as ordinary artifacts. Far to the north of the Sumerian heartlands, at the archaeological site of Tel Brak in modern-day northeastern Syria, excavations have revealed one of the most unsettling and intriguing discoveries of early Mesopotamian culture. Hundreds of small stone eyes, carefully crafted and deliberately buried beneath ancient structures. Tel Brak is one of the oldest urban centers in the ancient Near East, with occupation layers stretching back to at least 6000 BC. Long before the rise of the great Sumerian city-states of the south, this settlement was already developing complex architecture, social organization, and religious expression. It is here, deep within strata predating many written records, that archaeologists uncovered the so-called Eye Temple. Within this structure, they found a remarkable concentration of objects, small figurines made of alabaster, gypsum, and stone, each featuring oversized, exaggerated eyes. Some are humanoid in form, with elongated bodies and simplified limbs. Others are more abstract, reduced almost entirely to heads or symbolic shapes, with the eyes dominating their design. They are not rare. They are not isolated. They appear in numbers that suggest intentional production on a large scale, and yet their purpose remains uncertain. The most immediately accepted interpretation is rooted in religious symbolism. In early Mesopotamian belief systems, eyes were often associated with vigilance, divine awareness, and protection. These figurines may have been votive offerings, representations of worshippers eternally watching the deity, or symbolic stand-ins for human presence within sacred space. In this reading, the exaggerated eyes are not anatomical distortions, but expressions of spiritual attentiveness. Some scholars suggest that the figurines may represent supplicants placed within the temple as offerings, each one symbolically observing the god, ensuring continuous devotion even in the absence of worshippers. Others interpret them as representations of deities themselves, embodying omniscience and divine surveillance over the human world. But these explanations, while plausible, do not fully resolve the deeper questions raised by the site. Why are the eyes so disproportionately emphasized compared to the rest of the body? Why are the figures often buried deliberately beneath temple floors, as if placed in a ritual act of concealment or foundation deposition? And why do they appear in such large numbers, almost as if forming a collective presence rather than individual offerings? The act of burial is particularly intriguing. Many of the stone eyes were discovered beneath layers of construction, suggesting they were intentionally placed during building phases, possibly as part of consecration rituals. In ancient Mesopotamia, it was common practice to embed objects within the foundations of temples to sanctify the structure and secure divine favor. These deposits often included figurines, beads, tools, or inscribed tablets. Yet the eye temple figurines seem unusually uniform in theme and expression. Their repetition raises the possibility that they served a standardized ritual function that has not yet been fully understood. Some researchers have proposed that the figurines may represent a conceptual system rather than literal worshippers or deities. The eyes could symbolize perception itself, an early abstraction of awareness, observation, or presence. In this interpretation, the temple becomes not just a place of worship, but a space where visibility, consciousness, and divine attention converge. Still, this raises further questions. If the eyes represent awareness, who or what is doing the observing? Are they watching the gods, or are they symbols of being watched by them? Other interpretations move into more speculative territory. A small number of independent researchers have suggested that the eye temple figurines may reflect an early form of ritual communication, perhaps even encoding social or cosmological ideas through symbolic repetition. The uniformity of design could indicate a shared system of meaning, one that has not survived in textual form. If so, the figurines may be fragments of a symbolic language that predates written cuneiform, one that communicated ideas through form rather than script. More speculative theories suggest that the figurines could represent abstract entities or forces rather than human figures. The dominance of the eye motif has led some to wonder whether these objects were intended to represent unseen presences, guardians, spirits, or conceptual beings associated with perception and protection. In such interpretations, the eye temple becomes a space not of human representation, but of metaphysical mapping. However, no direct evidence confirms these ideas. What remains undeniable is the deliberate care with which these objects were made and placed. The repetition of form suggests intention. The act of burial suggests ritual significance. And the context of discovery, within one of the earliest known temple complexes in the region, places them at a critical moment in the development of human religious thought. As excavations continue, the eye temple remains a focal point for debates about early symbolism and belief systems. Some of the figurines are now displayed in museums, their silent, wide eyes staring outward across glass cases, as if still observing something beyond our understanding. In a broader sense, Brak challenges us to reconsider how early societies expressed ideas about presence and perception. Long before philosophical systems or written theology, people were already shaping objects that embodied abstract concepts. What did it mean, in a world without formal doctrine or scripture, to create hundreds of figures defined almost entirely by their eyes? Was it an expression of devotion, a method of protection, a symbolic language, or something else entirely? And perhaps more importantly, what do we lose when we try to interpret such objects solely through the frameworks of later history? Standing at the site today, the wind moves across the ancient ruins, carrying dust over foundations that once supported complex ritual life. Beneath that dust, beneath layers of forgotten architecture, the stone eyes of Brak once lay hidden, waiting for rediscovery. Even now, after decades of study, they do not fully surrender their meaning. They remain fixed in their gaze, silent, persistent, and unresolved. And so the question lingers. Were these stone eyes simply offerings of devotion, or do they preserve a far older and more elusive understanding of how early humans perceived the act of being seen? If the silent, unblinking eyes of Brak invite us to ponder the act of observation itself, the city of presents a different enigma. Movement, ritual, and paths that once carried processions of priests, worshippers, and perhaps even royalty, now vanished almost entirely beneath the layers of time. Located on the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, flourished as a major center of Sumerian civilization from around 3800 BC. Its Ziggurat, dedicated to Nana, the moon god, towers, or once towered, over the city, marking a sacred axis around which urban life revolved. Streets and thoroughfares, courtyards, and ceremonial gateways were not merely functional. They were deliberate channels guiding human and divine interaction, pathways along which sacred rituals unfolded. Yet today, much of what we assume about these processional routes is speculative. Excavations have uncovered fragments of streets paved with mud brick, remnants of monumental gateways, and the occasional ceremonial staircase, but the full continuity of the routes is elusive. Layers of rebuilding, centuries of sediment, and the slow encroachment of the desert have erased or obscured much of the urban plan. Archaeologists are left to reconstruct routes from fragmentary evidence, relying on faint alignments, textual references, and comparative studies with other Sumerian cities. Historical records, though tantalizing, offer only glimpses. Inscriptions and administrative texts reference processions, the movement of statues, ritual offerings, and priestly contingents through defined ceremonial spaces. Certain festivals, especially those honoring Nana, involved coordinated movement from temple to temple, courtyard to courtyard. The physical traces of these processions, the roads, raised platforms, and threshold markers, were once clearly delineated. Today, they survive in fragments, shadows of what was carefully orchestrated. Why are these routes so difficult to trace? Mainstream interpretations suggest practical explanations. Was inhabited and rebuilt for centuries. Each dynasty made structural changes, sometimes rerouting streets to accommodate new construction or shifting administrative centers. Floods from the nearby Euphrates, which periodically altered the landscape, may have washed away earlier paving. Natural sedimentation slowly buried once clear paths beneath meters of earth. In a city that evolved continuously over millennia, it is perhaps unsurprising that the original processional design was partially lost. Yet other details challenge purely practical explanations. The precision of the routes, where traceable, suggests a symbolic, almost ritualized function beyond mere transportation. Processional routes were more than streets. They were sacred corridors, choreographed stages upon which human action intersected with the divine. Certain gateways and alignments correspond to the positions of temples and altars, while some courtyards appear deliberately oriented to catch sunlight at specific times of year. These elements hint at a deep cosmological purpose embedded within the city's layout, knowledge that may now be partially obscured. Some scholars have proposed that the disappearance of the routes reflects ritual decisions rather than accident. Processional paths might have been intentionally altered or buried during renovations, symbolically transforming sacred journeys as the city evolved. Shifting the direction of a procession, or changing the starting point of a festival, could reflect political change, religious innovation, or attempts to consolidate power in a newly constructed temple precinct. Could the lost routes of be evidence of deliberate human intervention to encode authority or divine favor into the urban landscape itself? Beyond these conventional explanations, more speculative interpretations emerge. Independent researchers have noted that certain alignments, visible only in partial excavation or inferred from architecture, suggest routes that may have connected major temples in patterns reflecting Sumerian cosmology. Could these processions have mapped a celestial path on the ground, moving in harmony with the stars, the sun, or lunar phases? Did the movement of priests and sacred statues mirror patterns in the heavens, encoding knowledge about astronomy, agriculture, and divine order into the very streets of the city? Supporting this possibility is the alignment of the Nana Ziggurat with the surrounding urban plan. While not all scholars agree on astronomical intentionality, the correlation between key temples, open courtyards, and ceremonial gateways hints at a careful orchestration of movement that transcended mere utility. Walking the city in ritual might have been a physical enactment of cosmological principles, a lived embodiment of Sumerian understanding of the universe. The mystery deepens when considering the ephemeral nature of processions themselves. Unlike walls, buildings, or tablets, the act of ritual movement leaves almost no permanent trace. Even the best preserved streets convey little of the choreography that once animated them. One can map paths from physical remains, but the sound, timing, and rhythm of 1,000 participants, the priests, musicians, and worshippers moving as a unified body, cannot be recovered. These aspects of ritual are invisible in the archaeological record, existing only in texts, iconography, and imagination. In this sense, the lost processional routes are as much about absence as presence. They challenge us to interpret spaces that were defined not by static objects, but by movement through them. How does one reconstruct a ritual experience that depended on human bodies, seasonal timing, and divine attention? How much of Sumerian religious life has disappeared not because of destruction, but because it was inherently transient? Archaeologists have attempted to recreate these journeys, surveying the city, mapping alignments, and analyzing spatial relationships between temples, altars, and public spaces can suggest probable routes. Yet even the most carefully reasoned reconstructions are incomplete. Evidence is fragmentary. Streets may have been rerouted multiple times. Temples were rebuilt, courtyards reshaped. Floods and erosion have altered terrain. No matter how meticulous the methodology, the full original choreography of Ur's ceremonial life remains beyond reach. Could some aspects of these routes have been deliberately hidden or symbolically encoded? Certain temples feature raised platforms or concealed stairways, hinting at processional sequences known only to priests. Some corridors appear too narrow for large groups, suggesting controlled or secretive movement. Might some lost paths have served esoteric functions, restricted to select initiates or reserved for sacred festivals whose details remain unknown? Even today, walking across the exposed ruins of one can sense the rhythm of a vanished city. Courtyards open onto faint alignments of streets. Thresholds hint at carefully structured journeys. The shadows of monumental architecture suggest corridors for human and divine passage. The imagination can trace these invisible paths, glimpsing processions that have been erased by time yet remain alive in the spatial memory of the city. Ultimately, the lost processional routes of remind us that ancient cities were more than collections of walls and buildings. They were living, breathing landscapes of movement, ritual, and meaning. Their disappearance challenges modern perception, inviting questions that extend beyond archaeology into philosophy, ritual studies, and cosmology. How much of Ur's spiritual geography has been irretrievably lost? What knowledge, ceremonial practice, or divine presence was encoded in these paths that time and sediment have hidden? And what might still lie beneath the mounds, waiting to reveal the choreography of devotion that once animated one of humanity's earliest great cities? In contemplating the vanished processional routes, we are confronted with the subtle truth of Sumerian civilization. Some mysteries cannot be fully recovered. They survive only in traces, in alignments of streets and temples, in textual echoes, and in the imagination of those who seek to follow the steps of the past. The city itself, even in ruin, continues to pose questions, silent, patient, and haunting, like shadows of ritual long forgotten. If the lost processional routes of remind us that even sacred movement can fade into silence, the story now shifts to something far more abrupt, an ending not of gradual disappearance, but of sudden rupture. Roughly halfway between the great cities of Sumer, on the flat expanses of southern Mesopotamia, lies the ancient site of Abu Salabikh. Today it appears as a series of low, wind-shaped mounds, barely distinguishable from the surrounding desert. But in the 3rd millennium BC, this was a functioning Sumerian city, organized, literate, and deeply connected to the intellectual world of early Mesopotamia. It is not a city remembered for grandeur like or Uruk. Instead, Abu Salabikh is known to archaeologists for something quieter but equally profound. One of the earliest known archives of Sumerian literature, including hymns, lexical lists, and administrative texts that offer rare insight into the intellectual life of its inhabitants. For a time, it was a place where knowledge was recorded, categorized, and preserved with remarkable care. And then, at some point in its history, the city ceased to exist as an active center. Not gradually in the way cities often fade, but in a manner that suggests disruption, an ending that feels incomplete in the archaeological record. As excavation teams began uncovering Abu Salabikh in the 20th century, they found layers of occupation that revealed a structured urban settlement. Houses, administrative buildings, and scribal rooms appeared across the site, along with hundreds of tablets that had survived long enough to preserve fragments of the city's intellectual life. These texts include school exercises, god lists, myths, and lexical compilations, evidence of a scribal culture that was part of a broader Sumerian educational system. Yet beneath this preserved snapshot of life lies a deeper question. What happened to the city itself? The archaeological layers suggest that Abu Salabikh experienced a destructive event or series of events that marked the end of its occupation. Burned debris, collapsed structures, and disordered deposits appear in certain areas, hinting at sudden disruption. Some buildings show signs of rapid abandonment, with objects left in place as if their occupants had little time to prepare for departure. However, interpreting this evidence is far from straightforward. In Mesopotamian archaeology, destruction layers are common. Mud brick architecture is vulnerable to fire, collapse, flooding, and long-term decay. A building that burns, collapses, or erodes over centuries can create a stratigraphic signature that resembles sudden catastrophe, even when the underlying cause is gradual. So one mainstream explanation is environmental and structural. Abu Salabikh may have declined due to shifting water channels, soil salinity, or economic changes that made continued habitation difficult. In such a scenario, what appears as destruction could instead be the final stage of a slow abandonment process, compressed by time into a single visible layer. But the evidence does not entirely settle the matter. Some excavated areas show patterns that raise further questions. Concentrations of debris in specific zones, uneven preservation of artifacts, and the presence of intact tablets alongside collapsed architecture suggest a more complex sequence of events. Certain rooms appear to have been sealed by collapse rather than carefully dismantled, while others show signs that objects were left behind in haste. Could this indicate a sudden interruption to daily life? If so, what might have caused it? One possibility often considered by archaeologists is localized conflict. The 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia was a period marked by shifting alliances, city-state rivalries, and occasional warfare. Abu Salabikh, situated between larger and more powerful urban centers, may have been caught in regional instability. A raid, a brief military engagement, or political upheaval could potentially explain abrupt damage to parts of the settlement. Yet there is limited direct evidence of large-scale warfare at the site itself. No clear mass burial layers, no widespread weapon deposits, and no definitive destruction signatures typical of prolonged siege warfare have been identified in a way that would confirm such an event. This absence leaves room for other interpretations. Environmental catastrophe remains another consideration. The Mesopotamian floodplain was shaped by shifting rivers, seasonal inundations, and unpredictable water behavior. A sudden change in the Euphrates course, or an extreme flooding event, could have damaged infrastructure, contaminated agricultural land, and forced rapid abandonment. Water damage can also accelerate the collapse of mud brick structures, producing chaotic deposits that mimic destruction layers. But again, the evidence is partial. What makes Abu Salabikh particularly intriguing is not just its physical remains, but what survived within them, its texts. Among the most remarkable discoveries are early literary and lexical tablets, including lists of words and thematic groupings that suggest a sophisticated system of education. These documents imply a society deeply engaged in categorization, language, and intellectual structure. Scribes were not merely recording transactions. They were participating in a broader cultural effort to organize knowledge itself. And yet, the very preservation of these tablets adds a paradox to the site. Why did so many written records survive while the city that produced them did not? Some scholars suggest that the tablets were preserved precisely because of destruction. In many Mesopotamian sites, fire, while devastating to organic materials, could accidentally bake clay tablets, making them more durable. In this interpretation, the survival of Abu Salabikh's archive is not a sign of stability, but of catastrophe. Still, this raises another question. If the destruction was severe enough to preserve texts in this way, what became of the people who wrote them? The human dimension of Abu Salabikh remains elusive. Unlike royal cities with monumental inscriptions celebrating rulers and victories, this site offers a quieter glimpse into everyday intellectual life. It feels less like a capital and more like a working center of scribal activity, embedded within a wider network of Sumerian culture. And perhaps that is what makes its ending more difficult to interpret. Without grand inscriptions describing conquest or destruction, the narrative must be reconstructed from fragments, walls, tablets, ash, and absence. Some researchers have proposed that Abu Salabikh may have been affected by systemic regional changes that reshaped settlement patterns across southern Mesopotamia. As cities like Uruk and grew in prominence, smaller centers may have gradually lost population and importance. In this view, what appears as destruction could be the archaeological residue of long-term economic and political centralization. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for the abruptness suggested in certain excavation layers. As with many ancient sites, ambiguity remains. There are also more speculative interpretations, offered by independent researchers who point to recurring patterns of unexplained abandonment across multiple early Mesopotamian settlements. Some have suggested that environmental cycles, perhaps linked to long-term climate fluctuations, may have triggered periods of sudden stress on agriculture and water systems. Others have wondered whether interconnected cities like Abu Salabikh experienced cascading effects, where disruption in one center contributed to instability in another. These ideas remain difficult to verify, but they reflect a broader truth. Early urban life in Mesopotamia was deeply dependent on fragile environmental systems, and small shifts could have large consequences. What remains constant across interpretations is the sense of interruption. A city that once participated in the early intellectual world of Sumer, producing texts, training scribes, and maintaining administrative order, was eventually reduced to ruins, its structures buried beneath centuries of wind and sediment. Walking across Abu Salabikh today, there is little to suggest the complexity that once existed here. The landscape is quiet, almost empty, as if the city has been carefully erased. Yet beneath the surface, the remains of walls and tablets still carry traces of human thought, fragments of language, education, and belief preserved against time's erosion. And so the mystery persists. Was the end of Abu Salabikh the result of sudden destruction, gradual decline, environmental change, or a combination of forces that can no longer be separated in the archaeological record? How much of its final chapter is still buried beneath the desert, waiting to be uncovered? Perhaps the most haunting aspect is not what we know, but what we cannot yet reconstruct. A city that once produced knowledge now exists only as scattered remnants of that knowledge itself. And as we continue to piece together its story from fragments of clay and stone, one question remains suspended over the ruins of Abu Salabikh. What truly marks the end of a city, the moment it is destroyed or the moment it is forgotten? If Abu Salabikh reminds us that entire cities can disappear almost without trace, leaving only fragments of human knowledge behind, then the ancient city of presents a different kind of mystery, one of absence within presence. Here, where the earth has been meticulously excavated, where tombs of kings and queens have been uncovered with astonishing preservation, there are still questions that refuse to be answered. Beyond the famous royal cemetery, whispers of missing graves, unlocated burials, and unexplained voids continue to haunt our understanding of Sumerian power, ritual, and mortality. The royal cemetery of discovered in the 1920s and 1930s under the direction of Sir Leonard Woolley, offered a window into Sumerian funerary practices that remains unmatched in the ancient world. Spectacular tombs, carefully constructed with wood, stone, and brick, contained elaborate assemblages of jewelry, weapons, ceremonial vessels, and human attendants. Among these, the Great Death Pits revealed the remains of dozens of individuals interred in ritualistic alignment with the elite, offering a glimpse into the complex social, religious, and political hierarchies of the Third Dynasty of around 2100 BC. Yet, for all its grandeur, the cemetery tells only part of the story. Scholars have long noted irregularities in the distribution of tombs. While major tombs cluster within well-defined mounds, historical texts and inscriptions suggest the existence of additional royal burials that have never been found. These missing graves are referenced indirectly through administrative documents, offering lists of entitlements, ceremonial roles, and commemorations for rulers whose tombs do not appear in the excavation record. Some names are known only from inscriptions on tablets discovered elsewhere, hinting at the ruler's existence and funerary significance without providing physical confirmation of their resting places. Why were these graves never located? One plausible explanation is the nature of urban expansion. Like many Sumerian cities, underwent centuries of construction, rebuilding, and repurposing of land. Subsequent generations may have demolished, relocated, or overbuilt earlier tombs, intentionally or inadvertently erasing their physical traces. Flooding and sediment deposition from the nearby Euphrates could have further buried or obscured sites, leaving tombs hidden beneath meters of soil. Even deliberate preservation techniques of the Sumerians, such as mound building and brick lining, could not guarantee survival against the combined forces of time and environment. Yet certain details challenge this explanation. The missing graves are not random. They often correspond to rulers or royal family members, whose prominence suggests their tombs would have been monumental. In societies as hierarchical and ceremonially meticulous as Sumer, it seems unlikely that kings or high-ranking queens would be left unburied or interred without care. Could their absence point to deliberate erasure, perhaps linked to political upheaval, dynastic rivalries, or ritualistic transformation? Historical precedent supports such possibilities. In later Mesopotamian history, rulers sometimes sought to rewrite the past, destroying or reassigning tombs of predecessors to consolidate power or suppress challenges to legitimacy. Could similar forces have operated during the Third Dynasty of removing certain burials from the ceremonial landscape to reflect political changes? Archaeological evidence offers only tantalizing hints. Isolated mounds with partial disturbances, inconclusive stratigraphy, and occasional scattered artifacts that may belong to the missing tombs, yet resist definitive attribution. Environmental and social upheaval also remain contenders in the mystery. The Euphrates, prone to shifting channels and catastrophic flooding, could have rendered certain areas unsuitable for continued interment, forcing relocations of burials to safer zones. Alternatively, regional conflict, whether external invasion, civil unrest, or internal coup, might have disrupted funerary practices, leaving some royal deaths uncommemorated or hastily interred. These scenarios are difficult to prove, but gain credibility when considered alongside evidence of urban destruction and sudden abandonment in other Sumerian sites, such as Abu Salabikh and Nippur. Even the tombs that have been found contain subtle enigmas that hint at deeper ritual complexity. The positioning of bodies, the orientation of objects, and the meticulous arrangement of grave goods suggest a funerary system governed by strict rules of cosmic and ceremonial significance. If certain royal graves are missing, might it reflect an unrecorded variation in ritual, special tombs designed to be concealed or protected from sight? Were some rulers interred in secret to safeguard their remains or to follow esoteric religious beliefs that have left no textual record? Independent researchers have speculated on this possibility. Some suggest that the missing tombs could be linked to sacred topography outside the main cemetery, a network of burials beyond the excavated mounds, perhaps aligned with celestial bodies, sacred rivers, or long-lost temples. Could kings and queens have been buried along ritual processional routes, now obscured by centuries of sediment and urban expansion, their tombs deliberately placed in liminal spaces between city and desert, between earth and water, to facilitate spiritual journeys into the afterlife? Others offer a more provocative hypothesis, that some royal burials were intentionally removed or relocated in antiquity. The presence of scattered artifacts far from the main cemetery, coupled with textual references to lost mortuary offerings, lends credence to the idea that certain graves were moved for protective or ritual reasons. Whether due to threat, piety, or political decision, such acts would have been exceptional, leaving gaps in the archaeological record that modern excavation struggles to reconcile. Yet, even speculative interpretations return us to one persistent truth. The gaps themselves hold meaning. Missing graves are more than absences. They signal historical silences, forgotten rulers, and stories deliberately or inadvertently erased from memory. They challenge us to consider the fragility of the archaeological record and the ways in which time, human choice, and environment conspire to conceal knowledge. Walking across the excavated cemetery of today, it is possible to feel the weight of what is present and what is missing. The monumental tombs, the carefully arranged artifacts, the ghostly outlines of walls and chambers all convey meticulous planning, ritual care, and societal devotion. Yet at the periphery, beyond mounds mapped and studied, lies a space of uncertainty, unexcavated layers, buried strata, and perhaps tombs yet to be discovered, waiting silently beneath centuries of dust and sand. In contemplating the missing royal graves, we confront a broader question about memory, legacy, and power. What does it mean for a ruler's final resting place to vanish? Is the impact of their life diminished, or does the mystery itself confer a different kind of presence, one that persists in texts, in oral traditions, and in the imagination of those who seek to reconstruct the past? Perhaps the greatest challenge is accepting the limits of knowledge. Even with meticulous excavation and careful scholarship, the royal cemetery of cannot fully account for all those who once walked, ruled, and were honored in life and death. The missing graves remind us that history is composed as much of absences as of presences, as much of questions as of answers. And so, as the sun sets across the mounds of casting long shadows over tombs both known and unknown, we are left with a haunting thought. For every grave uncovered, how many more remain hidden? For every ruler whose death is recorded in stone or clay, how many more have been lost to time? The missing royal graves of continue to evoke wonder, speculation, and reverence, a silent testament to the enduring mystery of Sumerian civilization and to the secrets still buried just beyond our reach. If the missing royal graves of hint at absence within even the most celebrated ceremonial spaces, then the ritual pits discovered beneath Sumerian shrines reveal an entirely different layer of mystery, one hidden not in what is absent above ground, but in what lies buried, literally beneath the feet of worshippers. These pits, some circular, others rectangular, often carefully lined with mud brick or stone, have been unearthed in several prominent Sumerian sites, including Eridu, Nippur, and Lagash. Yet despite careful excavation, their precise purpose remains shrouded in uncertainty, leaving modern scholars to navigate a space where fact, ritual, and speculation intersect. The first encounters with these subterranean features were subtle. Early excavators noticed depressions in the ground beneath temple floors, some filled with layered soil, ash, or deliberately placed objects. In certain shrines, the pits contained unusual assemblages, broken pottery, small figurines, carved stones, and, in rare cases, remnants of organic material. Careful stratigraphic analysis revealed that many of these pits had been used repeatedly over generations, suggesting long-term ritual significance rather than one-off events. Yet despite these repeated depositions, there is little uniformity. No single type of artifact appears consistently. No text explicitly explains the practice. No inscriptions provide ceremonial instruction. Archaeologists have offered a range of interpretations. Some propose that the pits functioned as symbolic foundations, ritualized anchors meant to bind the spiritual presence of a deity to the temple structure. Others suggest they were votive deposits, offering objects, animals, or even symbolic sacrifices to the gods in a controlled subterranean space. In some instances, the layering of soil and ash hints at repeated ritual closures, where offerings were sealed into the ground and then covered, perhaps marking cycles of religious observance or seasonal celebration. Yet even these mainstream interpretations cannot fully explain the complexity and diversity of the pits. At certain shrines, pits contain miniature architectural models, sometimes remarkably detailed, while at others, there are strange arrangements of small, cone-shaped objects or figurines whose significance is elusive. Some pits include traces of pigments, metal, or organic matter that cannot be easily classified. Why these variations? Were the contents symbolic, instructive, or intentionally obscure, accessible only to those initiated into specific religious knowledge? The temporal context adds another layer of intrigue. Many of these pits date to the early dynastic period, around 2900 to 2350 BC, a time when Sumerian religious practice was highly codified but also locally diverse. Ritual innovation seems to have been tolerated, or even encouraged, alongside formalized temple ceremonies. Could the unusual nature of some pits reflect experimental or regionally specific religious practices? Might certain pits have been used for esoteric rites, known only to priests, or even as part of funerary or ancestor veneration practices, connecting the living community with past generations in ways now lost to history? Some of the more speculative interpretations arise from the unusual materials found within these pits. At several sites, archaeologists discovered small, polished stones resembling eyes, cones, or abstract shapes whose function is not clear. Were these symbolic representations of the gods themselves, miniature icons designed to mediate divine presence within the temple? Could some deposits, particularly those containing ash or traces of organic material, represent offerings meant to transform or energize the temple's foundation? In the absence of explanatory texts, all of this remains conjectural, but the patterns of care and deliberate placement suggest intent and significance beyond ordinary debris disposal. The location of the pits is also notable. They are almost always beneath temples or shrines, sometimes directly beneath sanctuaries where statues of deities would have been installed. This careful placement implies a connection between what lay below and the sacred activities above. Could the pits have functioned as conduits, linking earthly ritual with spiritual or cosmic forces? Did they serve as invisible stages for spiritual interaction, with the physical objects acting as mediators in ceremonies that left no written record? Even mundane explanations seem insufficient. While some early researchers suggested that pits might be simple storage features, trash deposits, or structural foundations, these interpretations fail to account for their careful construction, repeated reuse, and the deliberate arrangement of objects within them. The contrast between the ritual care evident in their contents and the casual disorder typical of refuse suggests that these pits were designed to endure and to serve a purpose beyond immediate utility. Another compelling angle emerges when considering Sumerian cosmology. The Mesopotamian worldview emphasized dualities: earth and sky, human and divine, life and death. Temples were not merely architectural structures. They were symbolic microcosms, physical representations of the universe where divine order and human activity intersected. In this context, the ritual pits might have functioned as symbolic underworld spaces beneath the visible temple, anchoring cosmic balance or facilitating communication between mortal participants and unseen divine forces. Yet, if we extend the inquiry beyond conventional scholarship, more enigmatic possibilities arise. Some independent researchers have noted parallels between the pits and ritual features in other ancient civilizations, including subterranean cultic chambers, hidden votive caches, or underground sacrificial spaces. Could the Sumerians have engaged in similarly hidden practices, deliberately removed from public view to maintain the sanctity, secrecy, or potency of the ritual? Were these pits a way to concentrate spiritual energy, or even to perform rites considered too sacred or dangerous for open exposure? There are also questions about the human element. Who was allowed to interact with these pits? Were they maintained and consecrated by a small group of priests, or could ordinary worshippers contribute to their contents? Did participation in the rituals associated with the pits convey special knowledge, social status, or spiritual protection? In the absence of direct textual instruction, we can only infer these possibilities from careful observation of placement, contents, and context. What continues to confound is the absence of explanatory inscriptions. Many Sumerian temples are rich with cuneiform records detailing offerings, dedications, and temple construction. Yet for the pits themselves, there is little written explanation. Was this secrecy intentional, part of the ritual's power? Or has the textual record been lost, destroyed, or perhaps hidden alongside the pits themselves? The silence invites us to imagine layers of ceremonial life that operated beyond the reach of ordinary documentation, known only to those who experienced it firsthand. Walking through the excavated temple sites today, one can sense the tension between the visible and the hidden. The shrine's walls and columns remain, but beneath the floor, the pits lie silent, some still sealed, some partially excavated, offering only fragments of meaning. The patterns of placement, the recurrence of certain symbolic objects, and the deliberate layering of soil and offerings suggest care, intent, and purpose, but also leave an open question. What was the ritual effect, the intended outcome, or the unseen reality that these pits facilitated? Even with modern techniques, ground-penetrating radar, chemical analysis, and meticulous stratigraphy, the full story eludes us. Each pit invites inquiry and speculation, yet every answer seems to multiply the questions. Were these spaces conduits for divine energy, vessels for transformation, or repositories of sacred knowledge meant to survive generations? Did they represent communal rites, elite ceremonies, or secret practices restricted to an inner circle? Ultimately, the strange ritual pits beneath Sumerian shrines remind us that ancient life was not fully transparent. Civilization leaves monuments, texts, and artifacts, yet it also leaves spaces deliberately hidden or incompletely recorded. These pits are a subterranean mystery, tangible yet enigmatic, deliberate yet inscrutable, silent yet resonant with the echoes of ritual action long vanished from human memory. And so, as we peer into these excavated spaces, we confront a paradox familiar throughout the Sumerian world. The more we uncover, the more questions emerge. Beneath the shrines, within the earth, the ritual pits persist as silent witnesses. They beckon us to imagine the ceremonies once performed above, to speculate on intentions, to consider the unseen dimensions of devotion, and to wonder what sacred knowledge remains buried, waiting for discovery, or forever lost to the shadows of time. If the ritual pits beneath Sumerian shrines suggest a hidden dimension of religious life, then the story of Lagash opens a different kind of subterranean mystery, one not of devotion, but of commerce, movement, and disappearance. For centuries, archaeologists have studied Lagash as one of the major city-states of southern Mesopotamia, a center of power, administration, and cultural innovation. Its temples, palaces, and administrative tablets reveal a city alive with economic activity, but evidence of its harbor, the very lifeline that would have connected it to trade networks across the rivers and the Persian Gulf, remains surprisingly elusive. Today, the site of Lagash, near modern-day Tel al-Hiba, is a quiet landscape of sun-bleached mounds and scattered ruins. In some ways, it feels frozen in time, a city that once thrived on commerce and exchange reduced to dust and wind. Yet beneath this seeming desolation, recent surveys suggest the presence of ancient water channels, some of which may have functioned as docks, canals, or harbor basins. Traces of mud brick quays, eroded wooden posts, and sediment layers hint at river traffic, but the scale, layout, and precise location of Lagash's harbor remain frustratingly unclear. The historical context is compelling. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, Lagash was a formidable city-state, governed by rulers such as Eanna and Uruk, whose inscriptions describe military victories, legal reforms, and public works. Its position on the river network would have made it an ideal hub for agricultural trade, movement of craft goods, and connections to distant lands along the Persian Gulf. Ancient texts reference goods such as barley, textiles, and precious metals passing through the city, implying the existence of sophisticated harbor facilities. Yet no fully intact dock or port has been definitively excavated, leaving a tantalizing gap between textual evidence and physical archaeology. Some mainstream explanations are straightforward. The harbor may have been constructed primarily from perishable materials, wood, reeds, and mud, that have long since decayed. River courses in southern Mesopotamia have shifted dramatically over the past 4,000 years, leaving former waterways dry and obscured by sedimentation. What was once a bustling harbor may now lie hidden under meters of alluvium or have been completely abandoned as the Euphrates and its tributaries migrated. Environmental transformation, compounded by centuries of human activity, may have erased the harbor from the visible landscape, leaving only subtle geological hints for modern archaeologists to detect. Yet even this logical explanation raises questions. Some surveys have identified depressions and sediment layers inconsistent with natural river shifts, suggesting deliberate excavation or modification of the land. Could the harbor have been intentionally altered, either to manage water flow, protect vessels, or conceal certain activities? And if parts of the harbor were deliberately obscured, might this reflect political, religious, or economic motives now lost to history? Another puzzle emerges when considering the broader urban layout. Lagash was a city of monumental temples, administrative centers, and streets aligned according to religious and civic principles. The missing harbor disrupts the expected relationship between the city and its waterways. In other Sumerian cities, such as Ur and Eridu, harbors and docks are evident, integrated with both urban planning and trade routes. Why does Lagash, otherwise rich in administrative and ceremonial infrastructure, seem to lack a clearly defined harbor in the archaeological record? Speculative interpretations offer intriguing possibilities. Some researchers suggest that the harbor may have been subterranean or semi-submerged, designed to remain hidden from view for strategic or ritual purposes. Could ships have docked along concealed channels, protected by walls or temples, effectively integrating maritime access with sacred space? Such an arrangement would not be unprecedented. Later Mesopotamian cities, including Babylon, are known to have combined practical and ritual considerations in their water management systems. Others consider political motives. Lagash was often at odds with neighboring city-states such as Umma. Concealing a harbor or dispersing docking facilities along multiple channels could have been a defensive measure, minimizing the vulnerability of trade and transportation to rival powers. Could the very absence of an obvious harbor in the archaeological record be evidence of intentional urban design, a city whose maritime arteries were deliberately veiled or restructured in response to conflict? Yet these explanations remain speculative, precisely because the physical evidence is so fragmentary. Archaeologists have uncovered small, wharf-like deposits, remnants of mud brick quays, and traces of boat repair materials, but nothing that allows reconstruction of the harbor in full. Ancient canals show signs of sedimentation and occasional reinforcement, but the scale and function of these waterways remain contested. Some channels may have been irrigation ditches misinterpreted as harbor structures. Others may have been ceremonial watercourses rather than practical docks. Distinguishing functional infrastructure from ritual or symbolic construction is a persistent challenge in southern Mesopotamia. There are also enigmatic artifacts associated with the waterfront. Small clay models of boats, fragments of wooden vessels, and inscribed tablets recording trade transactions suggest organized commerce, yet they offer only indirect evidence of the harbor's physical location. These items hint at activity, movement, and maritime culture, but the tangible harbor that should have facilitated such operations remains elusive, buried beneath the sedimentary veil of millennia. Environmental factors complicate the story further. Southern Mesopotamia's alluvial plain has been profoundly altered by flooding, channel migration, and human engineering. The Euphrates, Tigris, and their tributaries have shifted over time, leaving former harbor sites buried, misaligned, or silted over. Even in areas where canals are preserved, distinguishing ancient harbor function from agricultural or ceremonial use is difficult. Could the harbor have been lost entirely to natural processes, or do the fragments that remain hint at a design both practical and symbolic, reflecting a city in which commerce and ritual were inseparable? Beyond practicality, there is the question of ritual and sacred space. Sumerian cities often intertwined religious and civic infrastructure. Temples and shrines dominated city centers, while water held symbolic significance in creation myths, purification rites, and agricultural ceremonies. Could parts of Lagash's harbor have been deliberately integrated with sacred precincts, hidden or partially submerged to maintain ritual sanctity while facilitating trade? Were these spaces designed for both human and divine navigation, linking commerce with cosmology? Even as modern archaeology advances, with geophysical surveys, sediment analysis, and remote sensing, the mystery endures. The forgotten harbor of Lagash reminds us that urban landscapes, especially those in dynamic riverine environments, can erase evidence almost as quickly as they preserve it. It challenges scholars to reconcile textual, material, and environmental data, and invites us to consider how Sumerians themselves may have navigated the delicate balance between utility, ritual, and security. Walking across the ruins today, one can sense the pulse of the lost waterfront, the imagined movement of boats gliding along mud-lined channels, merchants exchanging goods beneath sun-bleached ziggurats, and priests invoking the favor of gods over the waters that fed the city's lifeblood. And yet, despite traces in text, artifact, and soil, the harbor itself remains largely absent. A gap between expectation and evidence, memory and material reality. The forgotten harbor of Lagash is more than a missing port. It is a meditation on absence and presence, on what a city leaves behind and what it can erase. It prompts questions not only about trade, politics, and engineering, but also about perception, ritual, and intentional concealment. How did the people of Lagash conceive of their rivers and channels? Did they hide their harbor for practical, strategic, or spiritual reasons? Or has time simply buried it beyond reach, leaving only whispers beneath the desert sediment? As we trace the contours of ancient Lagash and peer into the layers of its vanished harbor, the mystery remains open. For every wharf fragment, boat model, or sedimentary trace, countless questions emerge. What did it mean to navigate these waters? Where did the harbor begin and end? How did the hidden channels shape the life, politics, and rituals of this ancient city? And most profoundly, what else lies beneath the ground, waiting silently to reveal the maritime pulse of a civilization that once connected rivers, cities, and distant lands in ways we can only imagine? If the forgotten harbor of Lagash speaks of a civilization shaped by water, yet partially erased by its movements, then the next mystery carries us further back into the southern marshlands of Mesopotamia, to a place where land and water were never truly separate. Near the ancient city of Eridu, often regarded as one of the earliest urban settlements in Sumerian tradition, archaeologists have encountered a discovery that challenges expectations of early riverine life. The remains of what appear to be buried boats, carefully interred beneath layers of sediment and mud brick. Eridu itself, located near the southern edge of Mesopotamia, occupies a unique place in Sumerian history. According to tradition, it is one of the oldest cities in the world, associated with the god Enki, deity of water, wisdom, and creation. Archaeological layers at the site reveal a long sequence of occupation stretching back to the Ubaid period, around 5400 BC, making it a key location for understanding the transition from early village life to complex urban society. Temples dedicated to Enki dominate the site's religious landscape, reinforcing the city's symbolic connection to water, not just as a resource, but as a sacred force. It is within this watery cultural context that reports of buried boats near Eridu become particularly intriguing. Across several excavation surveys conducted in the wider region of southern Mesopotamia, researchers have identified wooden impressions, reed bundle remnants, and soil discolorations consistent with ancient watercraft. In some cases, these traces appear in deliberate stratigraphic contexts, suggesting intentional deposition rather than accidental burial. The remains are not always complete vessels. Rather, they often present as partial hull outlines, preserved impressions in clay, or clusters of organic material shaped in ways that strongly resemble early boats. At first glance, such findings might not seem unusual. Boats were essential to life in southern Mesopotamia. The entire region was defined by marshes, rivers, canals, and seasonal flooding. Transportation by water was not only common, but necessary for trade, agriculture, and communication. Reed boats, wooden skiffs, and bitumen-coated vessels are well attested in later Sumerian texts and iconography. It would be expected, then, to find evidence of boat construction and usage in areas like Eridu. But what makes these particular finds unusual is not their existence, but their context. Some of the most intriguing traces appear not in riverbeds or harbor zones, but beneath architectural layers, under temple platforms, within ceremonial precincts, or embedded in stratigraphy that suggests intentional burial. This raises a fundamental question. Were these boats simply discarded, or were they placed there deliberately? Mainstream archaeological interpretations tend toward practical explanations. One possibility is that abandoned or damaged boats were reused as construction material or foundation fill. In environments where wood and organic materials were scarce, recycling vessels into architectural layers would have been a logical and efficient practice. Over time, sedimentation and rebuilding could have buried these remains, creating the impression of ritual deposition when none was intended. Another explanation involves environmental change. The shifting waterways of southern Mesopotamia frequently altered settlement patterns. A boat left stranded by a receding channel might eventually be buried by wind-blown sediment or later construction. In this view, the buried boats are not the result of deliberate action, but of gradual transformation in a dynamic river landscape. Yet certain discoveries complicate this interpretation. In some contexts, the remains appear too carefully arranged to be random debris. Fragments of reed bundles seem aligned, hull impressions appear preserved in situ, and in rare cases, associated artifacts such as pottery or small figurines are found nearby in structured patterns. These details suggest intentional placement rather than accidental burial. Why would boats be deliberately interred? One line of interpretation connects these findings to ritual practice. In Mesopotamian cosmology, water was not merely a physical element, but a sacred medium associated with creation, divine wisdom, and passage between worlds. Enki, the god of Eridu, was believed to reside in the subterranean freshwater realm known as the Abzu. In such a symbolic framework, boats may have held significance beyond their practical function. They could represent journeys, not only across rivers, but between spiritual domains. Some scholars suggest that buried boats may have served as ritual offerings to water deities. In this interpretation, placing a vessel beneath a temple or shrine could symbolize returning it to the sacred waters from which life was believed to emerge. The act of burial would then be less about disposal and more about transformation, returning human-made objects to the divine aquatic realm associated with creation and wisdom. This idea finds indirect support in Sumerian literature, which often describes ritual offerings to Enki involving water, purification, and symbolic journeys. Temples dedicated to him frequently incorporated water features such as basins, channels, and sacred pools. Could buried boats have been part of this broader ritual system, functioning as symbolic vessels meant to carry offerings, prayers, or even abstract concepts into the divine realm? However, not all researchers are convinced by strictly symbolic interpretations. Some propose that buried boats may reflect practical responses to environmental hazards. In flood-prone regions, damaged vessels could have been quickly submerged by sediment during seasonal inundations, later becoming incorporated into the archaeological record. Others suggest that catastrophic flooding events may have overwhelmed settlements, burying boats in place as rivers changed course abruptly. Mesopotamian flood narratives, preserved in later texts, hint at the cultural memory of such events, though correlating myth with specific archaeological layers remains challenging. Still, there are aspects that resist simple environmental explanation. In a few cases, boat-related deposits appear in areas with no clear evidence of flooding or river proximity. Instead, they are found within structured architectural zones, sometimes associated with religious buildings or carefully constructed platforms. This raises the possibility that certain boats were not simply lost or discarded, but intentionally placed as part of a broader architectural or ritual design. Could these vessels have functioned as symbolic foundations for sacred spaces? In ancient Mesopotamia, foundation deposits were common practice. Objects such as figurines, inscribed tablets, and ceremonial items were buried beneath buildings to consecrate them. If boats were included in such practices, they may have symbolized safe passage, divine protection, or the establishment of sacred order within a fluid, unpredictable environment. Beyond these interpretations lies a more speculative field of inquiry. A small number of researchers have suggested that buried boats might represent a form of ritual time capsule, preserving objects associated with specific ceremonies or events. In this view, the boats could have functioned as containers for offerings or symbolic cargo, sealed and buried as part of complex rites marking transitions, such as temple dedications, royal ceremonies, or seasonal festivals. Others have considered whether certain boats may have been intentionally decommissioned in a ritualized manner, mirroring practices seen in other ancient cultures where vehicles, weapons, or tools were ceremonially retired by burial or deposition in sacred contexts. If so, the boats near Eridu might reflect a worldview in which objects were not merely discarded when their use ended, but transitioned into a different ontological state through ritual action. Yet despite these theories, the evidence remains fragmentary. No single excavation has revealed a complete, intact ceremonial harbor of buried boats. Instead, what exists are scattered traces, partial hulls, impressions, organic residues, and contextual anomalies. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, but the full picture remains elusive. The challenge is compounded by the nature of the landscape itself. The southern Mesopotamian plain is constantly shifting, shaped by sedimentation, water flow, and millennia of human activity. What lies buried beneath Eridu today may not reflect a single moment in time, but layers of repeated occupation, reuse, and transformation. Boats may have been buried, exposed, reused, or reburied multiple times, complicating efforts to distinguish ritual intent from environmental process. Still, the persistence of these findings invites reflection. Eridu is already a city associated with origins, of kingship, of urban life, and in Sumerian tradition, of civilization itself. That buried boats appear in its vicinity adds a symbolic dimension that is difficult to ignore. Boats, after all, are vessels of transition. They move across boundaries, land and water, known and unknown, life and journey. To find them buried beneath one of the world's earliest cities is to encounter a paradox: movement preserved in stillness, mobility captured in sediment. The sun, low and amber, spills its light across the ancient plains of southern Mesopotamia, casting long shadows over the remnants of a civilization that thrived more than 4 millennia ago. Here, among the quiet ruins of what were once bustling city-states like Uruk, and Lagash, the earth keeps its secrets closely. Amid the clay bricks and fractured ziggurats lie traces of human ingenuity that hint at something almost otherworldly: the vanished workshops of Sumer's earliest scribes. Imagine a narrow alley in the heart of Uruk, lined with low mud brick walls, the scent of baked clay lingering faintly even today. Within these walls, some 5,000 years ago, a young apprentice would have sat cross-legged on the cool floor, stylus in hand, pressing wedge-shaped impressions into damp clay tablets. Around them, the air would have been thick with the sound of scribes murmuring formulas, lists, and stories, a rhythm of recording that would shape the earliest known writing system, cuneiform. Yet, despite the wealth of tablets that have survived the millennia, the very spaces where this knowledge was painstakingly inscribed are conspicuously absent. Archaeologists have long marveled at the paradox. Whole archives of administrative records, hymns, and legal codes survive, meticulously catalogued by modern researchers, but the physical workshops, those intimate spaces where scribes honed their craft, are ghostly in their absence. Mud brick walls crumble easily, true, yet one might expect to find traces: remnants of desks, pottery jars filled with ink, scraps of clay still imprinted with the practiced hand of an apprentice. Instead, we find open courtyards, scattered tablets, and tantalizingly little else. How could an entire network of intellectual centers vanish so thoroughly from the archaeological record? Mainstream scholars suggest a variety of explanations. Some point to the ephemeral nature of the materials: mud brick erodes, timber decays, and tools, simple reeds and wooden pallets, leave little behind. Others argue that many of these workshops were integrated into larger temples or palaces, absorbed into the religious and political heart of the city, rather than existing as separate, identifiable structures. This perspective aligns with what we know of Sumerian society. Literacy was not widespread. Scribes were elite specialists, often trained in temple schools, and their work, though vital, was tightly controlled by powerful institutions. In this sense, the disappearance of physical workshops may reflect a societal design rather than an accident of history. Yet, as compelling as these explanations are, questions remain. In Uruk's Eanna district, for example, we find clusters of small adjacent rooms, some bearing signs of heavy foot traffic, others with floors so well trodden that traces of clay and mud remain compacted in the soil. Could these have been the long-sought scribal quarters? If so, why is there so little direct evidence of the scribes' tools or daily routines? Some researchers speculate that these rooms may have been deliberately cleared, either in antiquity or over centuries of rebuilding, to make way for newer structures. Others hint at the possibility of ritual concealment, a notion rooted in the Sumerian belief that words themselves carried sacred power. Could scribes have been working in spaces that were simultaneously practical and secret, hidden from the eyes of those not initiated into the mysteries of writing? Adding another layer to the intrigue is the sheer scale and sophistication of Sumerian literacy at such an early period. By 3000 BC, scribes were not merely recording inventories or tax lists. They were composing elaborate epics, hymns, and mythological texts. To accomplish this, one imagines a complex environment of study and collaboration, where knowledge was passed from master to apprentice, sometimes across generations. Yet the architecture that might have supported such intellectual life is remarkably elusive. Could it be that the workshops were mobile or semi-subterranean, designed to be concealed from invaders? Or perhaps they existed in forms that do not conform to our expectations. Clusters of workstations within temple complexes, hidden chambers behind ceremonial walls, or even structures that have been misidentified as ordinary domestic spaces? Speculation extends even further when considering the contents of the tablets themselves. Some texts hint at knowledge that seems to transcend mere record-keeping. Astronomical observations of unusual precision, intricate mathematical computations, and descriptions of rituals or technologies whose full meaning remains obscure. Could these have been produced in specially dedicated rooms, designed to facilitate concentration, secrecy, or spiritual attunement? And if so, why does the archaeological footprint remain so faint, so maddeningly absent? There are whispers, too, in the margins of scholarly literature, of fragments found far from the heart of Sumerian cities, tablets that seem out of place, as if scribes carried their work along trade routes, leaving hints of their practice scattered like breadcrumbs across the plains of Mesopotamia. Were these itinerant workshops, moving with merchants or priests, a deliberate strategy to preserve knowledge? Or do these traces reflect a pattern of diffusion that we are only beginning to recognize? As one walks among the ruins today, it is easy to feel the presence of these vanished scribes, as if the very walls are imbued with the echoes of styluses scratching across clay. Each step raises the question: how much of Sumer's intellectual world has simply slipped beneath the sand, leaving behind only tantalizing fragments? What wisdom, what stories, what insights into the dawn of writing and human thought remain hidden, awaiting discovery? In the end, the mystery persists. The workshops may be gone, yet their imprint lingers in the tablets, the ziggurats, and the faint, enduring rhythms of the cities they once animated. Were they simple workspaces, temples of knowledge, or something entirely beyond our imagining? Perhaps we will never know. And perhaps that is the enduring allure of these vanished scribes. They remind us that history is not merely a record of what survives, but a shadow of what was once present, now whispering through the ages. If the vanished workshops of Sumer's earliest scribes remind us of spaces where knowledge was created yet never fully preserved, then the tablets they left behind serve as cryptic echoes of a world that is only partially understood. Among the most enigmatic of these relics are the Proto-Cuneiform tablets, clay surfaces etched with symbols that defy complete interpretation, remnants of a language and system that emerged at the very dawn of writing. These tablets are scattered across sites such as Uruk, Jemdet Nasr, and Tel Brak, dating as far back as 3200 BC, a time when Sumerian civilization was beginning to crystallize complex urban structures, organized religion, and administrative hierarchies. Each tablet is a small, hardened window into an age where humans first attempted to translate the flow of life, commerce, and ritual into lasting marks of clay. Yet, as we peer closely at these symbols, a profound mystery emerges. Not all of them can be deciphered, even today. Proto-Cuneiform is recognized as a precursor to the more familiar cuneiform script. Early scholars initially believed the symbols represented purely economic records, quantities of grain, livestock tallies, and the movement of goods. Indeed, many tablets conform to this expectation, containing lists of commodities, numbers, and personal or institutional names. But interspersed among these intelligible markings are symbols whose purpose remains obscure. Some appear only once, never repeated in other contexts. Others recur but resist translation, offering tantalizing glimpses of an unknown symbolic language that may have carried religious, ritualistic, or bureaucratic significance beyond our grasp. At first glance, the mystery might appear mundane. Could these symbols simply represent clerical errors, idiosyncratic shorthand, or even artistic flourishes with no deeper meaning? Perhaps. The high-pressure environment of early administration may have encouraged scribes to innovate rapidly, adapting symbols to fit immediate needs. But such explanations fail to account for the consistency in form and style observed across distant sites, suggesting a shared symbolic vocabulary that was understood, at least in part, by contemporaneous practitioners. The tablets themselves are remarkable objects. Often small, a few inches wide, their surfaces were carefully prepared. Scribes used reed styluses to press wedge-shaped marks into soft clay, producing lines, triangles, and abstract motifs. Some tablets are remarkably dense with notation, while others contain just a handful of enigmatic marks. In certain cases, the symbols appear in systematic sequences, suggesting a structured system, perhaps even a proto-grammar, yet one whose syntax is not fully understood. Archaeologists note that some symbols seem to occupy positions equivalent to headings, numerical modifiers, or even personal signatures, hinting at layers of meaning that remain largely inaccessible. Mainstream interpretations have attempted to classify these symbols into categories: numerical signs, ideograms, and phonetic elements. Numerical signs are generally agreed to represent quantities, using a combination of vertical and horizontal wedges to denote units. Ideograms represent tangible objects, sheep, grain, pottery. But even within this framework, a number of symbols resist clear identification. They do not correspond to known commodities, animals, or common ritual implements. Some appear abstract, with no obvious reference in the physical or economic world. Are these symbols placeholders for lost knowledge, metaphors for intangible concepts, or perhaps references to localized practices or beliefs that vanished with the passage of millennia? A particularly intriguing subset of Proto-Cuneiform symbols appears only in the earliest strata of Uruk, within administrative layers associated with temple precincts. Some researchers speculate that these markings may relate to ritual or religious bookkeeping, cataloging offerings, sacred objects, or ceremonial events. If this is the case, then we are confronted with the possibility that early writing was not only a tool of economic control, but also a medium for recording spiritual or cosmological knowledge. Could some of these unidentified symbols represent elements of a ritual language, an early attempt to encode sacred knowledge in visual form? Others have proposed more speculative interpretations. Certain symbols bear geometric patterns and arrangements that suggest symbolic logic or even proto-mathematical concepts beyond mere counting. Could these early scribes have been experimenting with abstract representation, creating symbolic frameworks to order the world not only practically, but conceptually? Were some signs intended to record events, astronomical observations, or ritual sequences in ways that transcend simple literacy? Adding to the mystery is the inconsistency of context. Some symbols appear alone, as if serving as mnemonic devices, while others are embedded within sequences that seem deliberate, almost ritualistic. Occasionally, a symbol is repeated across multiple tablets separated by hundreds of miles, implying a shared system of understanding among scribes who likely never traveled between sites. How did such knowledge circulate? Were there networks of scribes exchanging techniques, or was the symbolic language standardized through some centralized or religious authority? The unanswered questions extend to the production of the tablets themselves. How were scribes trained to reproduce these symbols accurately? Excavations hint at scribal schools, edubas, but the precision and consistency of certain symbols suggests rigorous methods of instruction, possibly blending visual memory with verbal teaching. And yet, even within these training contexts, some symbols resisted easy categorization, suggesting that part of the scribal craft involved working with forms whose meanings were fluid, contextual, or even esoteric. Technological limitations also challenge our understanding. Clay, while durable, is vulnerable to breakage. Many Proto-Cuneiform tablets are fragmented, leaving scholars to reconstruct sequences and identify patterns from incomplete evidence. Even when complete, the interpretation of symbols often relies on comparison with later, fully developed cuneiform, introducing assumptions about continuity that may not have existed. Could some symbols represent fleeting concepts, temporary administrative markers, or experimental notations abandoned once more stable conventions emerged? There is also a subtle but important question of purpose. Were all Proto-Cuneiform symbols intended to convey semantic meaning, or did some function as ritual, symbolic, or mnemonic devices whose significance lay in their form or placement rather than literal interpretation? Some tablets seem almost ceremonial, set aside from the main administrative archive, their symbols arranged with care yet lacking obvious practical function. Could these represent an early intersection of literacy and ritual, where writing itself became a sacred act, and the act of inscribing clay carried power beyond mere record-keeping? Finally, the geographical and chronological spread of Proto-Cuneiform adds another layer of mystery. Symbols appear not only at Uruk, but also at neighboring sites such as Jemdet Nasr, Tel Brak, and Nippur, suggesting a network of scribal activity across southern Mesopotamia. Yet the appearance of certain unique signs at one site but not others implies local innovation or specialized knowledge. Were some symbols meant to remain secret, understood only by a select few, preserved within closed scribal communities? And if so, what happened to that knowledge once those communities disbanded, were destroyed, or evolved into different administrative systems? Standing before these tablets, it is impossible not to feel a sense of awe and unease. We can see the marks pressed into clay thousands of years ago, the work of hands long vanished, and yet the full meaning of those symbols eludes us. They are relics of a world that was emerging, a civilization taking its first steps in literacy, administration, and symbolic thought. But they are also reminders of how much remains hidden, how much of early human ingenuity lies beyond the reach of interpretation, waiting beneath layers of soil, sediment, and time. And so, the unidentified symbols on Proto-Cuneiform tablets continue to challenge our understanding of early writing. Were they purely practical, purely symbolic, or a complex combination of both? Did they encode economic data, sacred knowledge, or intellectual experimentation? And perhaps most intriguingly, how many other symbols, systems, or meanings have vanished entirely, leaving only tantalizing glimpses in the surviving fragments? As we continue to piece together the world of Sumer's earliest scribes, these cryptic markings remain a silent testimony to the birth of literacy and to the enduring mysteries of human thought at its inception. If the unidentified symbols on Proto-Cuneiform tablets reveal the first fragile attempts to give structure to thought itself, then the next mystery takes us out of the scribal room and into the open landscape of early Mesopotamia, where civilization first began to define not just meaning on clay, but meaning in space. Between the great rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, in the fertile plains where the earliest Sumerian city-states emerged around 3,500 to 3000 BC, the world was being divided in new ways. Land was measured, fields were assigned, canals were redirected, and settlements grew into competing urban centers such as Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and Umma. In this rapidly transforming environment, boundaries became more than practical divisions. They became declarations of power, identity, and divine sanction. And yet, one of the most curious absences in the archaeological record is striking. The boundary stones that should have marked these divisions are remarkably rare, fragmentary, or entirely missing in many of the earliest city-states. In later Mesopotamian periods, boundary stones, known in Akkadian as Kuduru, are well attested. These carved monuments recorded land grants, legal claims, and divine protections, often invoking gods as witnesses to territorial agreements. They were physical manifestations of law, politics, and sacred authority combined. But in the earliest Sumerian city-states, where territorial disputes were already intense and well documented in inscriptions, the material evidence for such boundary markers is unexpectedly sparse. This absence raises a fundamental question. How were the earliest city-states defining their borders? At sites like Lagash and Umma, textual sources describe disputes over land, irrigation channels, and agricultural territory. One of the most famous early conflicts recorded in Sumerian history concerns the contested boundary region known as the Guedina, a fertile agricultural zone between these two city-states. Inscriptions from Lagash describe cycles of conflict, treaty-making, and renewed tension over this land, suggesting that territorial boundaries were not only recognized but fiercely contested. And yet, despite the importance of these boundaries, the physical markers that would have defined them remain elusive. Archaeologically, boundary stones are difficult to identify in early contexts. Many surviving stones from later periods are inscribed, carved, and clearly distinguishable from ordinary markers. But earlier boundary indicators may have been far more modest. Uninscribed stones, wooden posts, reed markers, or even natural landscape features such as canals, embankments, or tree lines. If so, time and environmental change would have erased them almost completely. This is one of the most widely accepted explanations, that the earliest boundary systems were informal or semi-formal, relying on natural geography and perishable materials rather than durable monuments. Rivers shift, canals dry, wooden posts decay, and reeds disintegrate. Over millennia, such markers would vanish without trace, leaving only indirect evidence in administrative texts and legal disputes. But even this explanation does not fully account for the complexity implied by early Sumerian political organization. By the early dynastic period, city-states were sophisticated entities with structured administrations, codified temple economies, and organized labor systems. It is difficult to imagine that such societies would rely solely on ephemeral markers for something as crucial as territorial control. Land was the foundation of wealth, agriculture, and political power. Irrigation systems required precise coordination. Taxes and labor obligations depended on clearly defined regions. Could such a system function without durable, recognizable boundary markers? Some archaeologists suggest that early boundary stones may have existed but were later repurposed, destroyed, or buried during urban expansion. As cities grew, earlier territorial divisions could have been overwritten by new construction projects, effectively erasing the original markers. Temples and palaces often expanded over time, absorbing surrounding land and altering earlier spatial divisions. What once marked a boundary might later have become part of a courtyard wall, foundation fill, or irrigation channel. This process of architectural layering is well documented in Mesopotamian archaeology. Cities were not static. They were continuously rebuilt. Mud brick structures were especially prone to decay and reconstruction, meaning that earlier urban layouts were often subsumed beneath newer ones. In this sense, the disappearance of boundary stones may not be mysterious at all, but rather a natural consequence of urban evolution. Yet there are hints that complicate this view. Certain archaeological surveys have identified isolated standing stones and uninscribed markers in peripheral zones between ancient city territories. These stones, often weathered and displaced, lack the inscriptions characteristic of later boundary monuments, making their interpretation uncertain. Some may be natural formations. Others may have been deliberately placed but stripped of identifying features over time. Could these be remnants of an earlier boundary system, one that predates the formalized legal inscriptions of later Mesopotamia? The possibility opens a wider question about how early Sumerian societies conceptualized space. Were boundaries purely administrative constructs, or did they carry religious and cosmological significance? In Mesopotamian thought, land was often associated with divine ownership. Temples acted as economic centers, and gods were considered the ultimate landowners. Boundary disputes were not only political, but also theological, involving divine arbitration and ritual reaffirmation of territorial claims. In this context, boundary stones, if they existed in early form, may have served more than a legal function. They could have been sacred objects, embedded with ritual meaning, possibly marked with symbols or offerings that have not survived in the archaeological record. If such stones were consecrated, their removal or destruction might have been accompanied by ritual procedures that left little physical trace. Some researchers have even suggested that early boundary markers may have been intentionally designed to be temporary or periodically renewed. In a landscape shaped by shifting rivers and irrigation systems, fixed boundaries may have been less practical than flexible, negotiable ones. Instead of permanent stones, territories might have been defined through ritual reaffirmation ceremonies, where boundaries were re-established at regular intervals by priests or officials. If this were the case, the physical absence of boundary stones would not indicate loss, but a fundamentally different approach to territoriality, one in which space was continuously redefined through human and divine interaction rather than fixed material markers. There are also more speculative interpretations, emerging from attempts to reconcile textual evidence with archaeological gaps. Some independent researchers have suggested that boundary stones may have been deliberately removed or destroyed during periods of political consolidation. As city-states expanded or were absorbed into larger polities, earlier territorial markers might have been erased to legitimize new control. In this reading, the absence of stones is not accidental, but the result of historical processes of rewriting space itself. Others have proposed that boundary markers could have been made of perishable materials embedded within the landscape in ways that are now archaeologically invisible. Wooden posts, reed fences, or earthen mounds could have defined borders effectively in their time, but left no lasting trace. In a riverine environment prone to flooding and sedimentation, such markers would be highly vulnerable to destruction. Still, even if all of these explanations are combined, if the absence of boundary stones reminds us that much of Sumer's earliest urban organization remains hidden from view, then the discovery of foundation figurines buried deep within temple walls reveals another dimension of this civilization's secretive past. A world where ritual, devotion, and perhaps magic intertwined with architecture in ways we are only beginning to understand. These figurines, often no larger than a human hand, are found embedded in the mud brick or baked brick cores of temples, strategically placed beneath walls, corners, or thresholds. Sites such as Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, and Lagash have yielded fragments of these objects, their numbers varying from a handful to dozens within a single temple structure. Each figurine is unique, yet all share a deliberate, almost ritualistic quality. Sculpted in clay, sometimes painted, sometimes inscribed with tiny marks or symbols, often depicting humans, animals, or hybrid creatures whose meaning remains ambiguous. Archaeologists have long recognized the figurines as a form of foundation deposit, a practice known to many ancient cultures, in which objects are interred during the construction of sacred buildings. The intent appears symbolic: to protect the building, to consecrate it, or to ensure the favor of gods and spirits. Yet, in the case of Sumerian temples, these figurines present an enduring mystery. Unlike the monumental statues or votive figures placed for public veneration, these are hidden from view, sealed inside walls, their presence known only to those who buried them. Consider the Temple of Eanna in Uruk, one of the earliest monumental religious complexes, dating to around 3100 BC. Excavations revealed dozens of small clay figurines tucked into the corners of foundation trenches. Some depict standing figures with exaggerated eyes and hands folded in gestures of devotion. Others show animals rendered in abstract geometric forms. Their placement is precise. The corners, thresholds, and key junctions of walls suggest a careful plan, almost as if the figurines were intended to anchor the building spiritually or magically. Yet the meaning of each figure, the choice of pose, size, or motif, remains largely indecipherable. Mainstream explanations emphasize protection and ritual dedication. In this view, the figurines were essentially offerings, buried as part of a larger consecration ritual intended to invoke divine guardianship over the structure. Temples were not only religious centers, but also centers of economic and political authority. Protecting them from physical decay, spiritual intrusion, or human interference would have been paramount. The figurines may have symbolized the presence of deities, ancestors, or spiritual intermediaries, forming a hidden, sacred network of protection woven into the building itself. Yet, even within this framework, questions abound. Some figurines are deliberately deformed or unusual in appearance, hybrid creatures with bird-like heads, human torsos, or animal limbs. Were these symbolic representations of protective spirits, apotropaic figures meant to ward off misfortune, or something more enigmatic? The variation in style and motif suggests intentionality rather than random decoration. Could each figure have been associated with a particular ritual, temple function, or deity? And if so, why was this knowledge encoded in hidden objects rather than openly depicted in reliefs or inscriptions? Another puzzle lies in the materials. While most figurines are made of clay, sometimes carefully fired, others incorporate unusual substances, crushed shells, pigments, or small inlays of stone. Some bear inscriptions in Proto-Cuneiform, tiny sequences of symbols that echo the writing of administrative or ritual records. These inscriptions are rare, and their meaning uncertain, but they hint at the possibility that the figurines were not merely symbolic, but functional, part of a larger ritual system in which text, object, and architecture intersected. There is also the question of scale and repetition. In some temples, hundreds of figurines have been discovered. In others, only a few. Were these differences related to the status or wealth of the city-state, the specific deity honored, or the intended potency of the ritual? Did larger numbers of figurines confer greater protection, or was the power of a temple's foundation concentrated in the strategic placement of just a few key objects? The patterning of the deposits is deliberate, yet remains frustratingly opaque. Speculative interpretations expand further. Some researchers have suggested that the figurines could have represented actual individuals, temple patrons, priests, or royal officials, offering their presence and loyalty eternally to the sacred space. Others propose that the hybrid and abstract forms indicate symbolic encoding of knowledge, ritual instructions, or cosmological principles, a form of communication designed to be intelligible only to initiates or scribes who performed the consecration ceremonies. Could these objects represent an early form of secret knowledge, a hidden layer of meaning embedded directly into the fabric of sacred architecture? The hidden nature of the figurines also raises questions about perception and experience. In a bustling temple filled with priests, worshippers, and economic activity, the figurines were unseen, their presence known only to those who participated in the building's construction or consecration. This secrecy may have amplified their perceived potency. Concealed within walls and trenches, the figurines could be considered a spiritual core, a silent framework sustaining the temple's sanctity, even as the visible structure above endured human use, weather, and time. Modern excavations have occasionally uncovered layers of figurines beneath rebuilt temples, suggesting a long continuity of ritual practice. Temples were not static. They were frequently rebuilt, repaired, and expanded over centuries. Each new phase often included the placement of new foundation deposits, creating a palimpsest of sacred objects buried deep within the structure. Yet in many cases, earlier figurines were broken, reused, or displaced during reconstruction, leaving an incomplete record. This adds another layer of mystery. How many original figurines have been lost, and what knowledge, ritual, or symbolism has vanished with them? The figurines' role in Sumerian religion remains tantalizingly elusive. Were they primarily protective, or did they also serve as conduits for communication with the divine? Could the abstract forms reflect early Sumerian attempts to represent spiritual concepts beyond literal human or animal form? And how did these hidden objects fit into a larger worldview in which temples were both physical and cosmic centers, connecting earth, water, and sky in a sacred geometry only partially understood today? As we examine these tiny, secreted figures, we confront the larger enigma of Sumerian ritual practice. The civilization that gave birth to writing, monumental architecture, and urban governance also cultivated a hidden, interior life, embedding devotion, magic, and symbolism into the very walls of its temples. These figurines are a physical manifestation of that interiority, silent, hidden, and still haunting to modern eyes. Standing in the ruins of Uruk or Nippur, the imagination reaches out to these concealed figures. We can picture the hands of ancient builders pressing clay, sculpting tiny beings, and carefully setting them into trenches before walls were raised above them. The figures themselves are long buried, yet their presence endures, whispering of a civilization that invested even its foundations with spiritual meaning. And so, the strange foundation figurines of Sumerian temples remain an unsolved mystery. Were they merely protective charms, tokens of devotion, or coded vessels of sacred knowledge? Did they communicate hidden truths about the cosmos, the gods, or the temple's role in society? Or were they both mundane and extraordinary at once, bridging the visible and invisible, the worldly and the divine? As we consider these hidden objects, we are reminded that much of Sumerian civilization remains obscured beneath layers of time and sediment. For every temple we uncover, there may be countless figures, gestures, and rituals that have vanished entirely, leaving only tantalizing traces. And in the quiet presence of these small, buried forms, we are invited to imagine the unseen, to ponder the invisible rituals that shaped the earliest civilizations, and to wonder what else remains concealed, waiting to be rediscovered in the walls of Sumer's sacred spaces. As the exploration moves away from the mythic echoes of kings and inscriptions carved into clay, the landscape shifts once again, away from palaces and temples, and towards something quieter, more technical, and arguably more essential to survival itself. Beneath the sun-scorched plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the horizon seems to dissolve into heat and dust, lies the ancient city of Girsu. Today, it is known through the archaeological site of Tello in modern-day Iraq, but in antiquity, Girsu was one of the major centers of the Sumerian world. It stood within the region of Lagash, a powerful city-state that flourished between roughly 2600 and 2100 BC. While its temples dedicated to deities like Ningirsu have drawn much attention, another quieter system once sustained the city's life, one that rarely survives in stone inscriptions or monumental art: the water management system of Girsu. At first glance, the remains are almost unremarkable: faint depressions in the earth, eroded channels that fade into the soil, and fragments of levees that no longer hold back anything. Yet these traces suggest something far more complex than simple irrigation. They point to a carefully engineered hydraulic network, one that may have shaped not only agriculture, but the very structure of the city itself. In a land where rainfall was scarce and unpredictable, survival depended on control. control of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and the seasonal floods that could either bring fertility or destruction. Girsu, like other Sumerian cities, did not passively receive water. It negotiated with it. Canals appear to have radiated outward from the city, channeling river water into surrounding agricultural fields. Secondary channels likely distributed flow with increasing precision, while embankments and levees helped regulate overflow. Some archaeologists suggest the presence of basin irrigation techniques, where fields were deliberately flooded and then drained to deposit nutrient-rich silt. This was not accidental agriculture. It was an early form of landscape engineering. And yet, when modern researchers attempt to reconstruct the full system, gaps begin to appear. Certain canal alignments seem too deliberate, too geometrically consistent to be explained purely by gradual expansion. Some channels appear to bypass natural topography in ways that suggest coordinated planning across a wide area. Was this system built in stages over centuries, or was there a moment when a more unified design was imposed upon the land? The written records of Girsu add another layer of intrigue. Administrative tablets speak in careful detail about grain, labor, and temple offerings, and occasionally mention canal maintenance and dredging operations. Officials were assigned to oversee water distribution, suggesting that the system was not only physical but bureaucratic, an infrastructure managed with the same seriousness as religious ritual. Water, in Girsu, was not just a resource, it was governance. But the physical remnants raise questions that the tablets do not fully answer. Some scholars have noted that sediment patterns in the region hint at shifting river courses over time, which may have forced repeated redesigns of the canal system. Others point to evidence of salinization in ancient soils, an accumulation of salt that eventually rendered fields less productive. If true, this would suggest that the very system designed to sustain Girsu may have also contributed to its long-term decline. Still, there are quieter, more speculative interpretations that occasionally surface in academic margins and alternative histories. Could the hydraulic network of Girsu have been more extensive than what has been preserved? Some have proposed that what remains today is only a fragment of a far larger irrigation web, one that connected multiple cities across southern Mesopotamia into a single managed water landscape. In this view, Girsu was not an isolated city maintaining its own canals, but part of a regional hydraulic continuum. Others go further, suggesting that the precision of certain ancient canal systems implies a level of planning that modern assumptions underestimate. They point to alignments that appear to follow long, straight courses across difficult terrain, or to basin structures that seem optimized for large-scale water retention. From this perspective, the system may reflect a depth of engineering knowledge that was later lost or fragmented over time. There are even more speculative ideas, rarely accepted in mainstream archaeology, that propose the existence of advanced surveying techniques or centralized water control mechanisms that have left little trace. These interpretations remain controversial, largely because the physical evidence is incomplete and heavily eroded. Yet they persist at the edges of discussion, fueled by the sense that something about the scale and coordination of Mesopotamian water systems still feels only partially understood. What remains grounded, however, is the undeniable fact that without water management, Girsu could not have existed at all. The city was not simply built beside a river, it was actively integrated into a manipulated hydrological environment. Fields, canals, and settlements formed a single interconnected system, fragile and responsive to seasonal change. And perhaps that is where the deeper mystery lies, not in what was built, but in how dependent it all was on balance. A slight shift in river flow, a failure to maintain a canal, a gradual buildup of salt in the soil. Any of these could alter the fate of an entire city. Over time, Girsu declined. Its political importance faded, its temples fell silent, and its canals silted up. The water that once sustained it either changed course or could no longer be controlled with the same precision. What remained was gradually buried beneath wind-blown earth and centuries of abandonment. Today, archaeologists trace those forgotten channels like faint memories in the soil. They map, measure, and attempt to reconstruct a system that once determined the rhythm of daily life. When fields were watered, when crops were planted, when the city itself could thrive. Yet even with modern tools, the full picture remains just out of reach. There are still sections that do not quite align, still patterns that suggest coordination beyond what survives, still questions about how such a system evolved, expanded, and ultimately unraveled. Was the water network of Girsu simply an early masterpiece of pragmatic engineering, gradually built and maintained by generations of careful labor? Or does it reflect a broader, more integrated vision of landscape management than we have yet fully reconstructed? And as the remnants of those canals fade further into the soil, one question lingers quietly beneath the surface. How much of the system has truly been rediscovered, and how much of it is still waiting, hidden beneath the same earth that once sustained it? As the faint traces of Girsu's canals fade into the dust of southern Mesopotamia, the story does not end with water disappearing from the land. Instead, it shifts, quietly, almost imperceptibly, toward a different kind of absence. Not the loss of infrastructure, but the loss of presence itself. Entire settlements, once active and structured, seem to fall silent across the archaeological record as we move forward in time. The transition leads us northward and slightly forward in chronology into a period archaeologists refer to as the Jemdet Nasr phase, roughly spanning 3,100 to 2,900 BC. It is a world still forming the foundations of urban life, still experimenting with administration, writing, and centralized organization. And yet, within this formative era, something unsettling appears in the ground. Settlements that were once occupied are simply abandoned. Jemdet Nasr itself, located in central Mesopotamia, gives its name to this entire cultural horizon. Excavations reveal mud brick architecture, early administrative tablets, cylinder seals, and carefully organized storage systems. These are not temporary camps or fragile encampments. They are structured communities with signs of planning, trade, and bureaucratic oversight. And yet, in layer after layer, archaeologists encounter a repeated pattern: occupation, development, and then sudden discontinuity. Rooms left with pottery still in place, storage areas with goods apparently not fully distributed, hearths that were not slowly worn down by time, but seemingly left in a final moment of use. Then, nothing. No gradual decay in some cases, no long-term rebuilding on the same footprint. Just abandonment. What happened here? One of the most widely accepted explanations lies in environmental change. The Jemdet Nasr period sits within a long arc of climatic variability in Mesopotamia, where shifts in rainfall patterns and river behavior could dramatically alter agricultural productivity. A slight reduction in water availability, especially in a landscape already dependent on irrigation, could force communities to relocate in search of more stable conditions. This idea aligns with what is seen in later periods as well. Settlement patterns in southern Mesopotamia were never static. Cities rose, shifted, and sometimes declined as river channels migrated across the floodplain. In this view, Jemdet Nasr settlements were not mysteriously abandoned. They were gradually outcompeted by geography itself. But even this explanation does not account for every detail. Some sites show signs of organized closure rather than chaotic departure. Objects are not always scattered as if people fled in panic. In certain structures, goods appear to have been left in an orderly manner. Administrative materials, in particular, sometimes remain stored rather than discarded. it raises a subtle question. Were some of these spaces intentionally vacated? The written record offers limited clarity. Jemdet Nasr tablets are among the earliest examples of Proto-Cuneiform writing, largely administrative in nature, recording commodities, labor, and institutional transactions. Yet they remain silent on collapse or migration. They describe a functioning system, not its dissolution. And so the silence of the texts contrasts with the silence of the sites. Archaeologists have long debated whether this pattern reflects a broader process of urban consolidation. Perhaps smaller Jemdet Nasr settlements were gradually absorbed into emerging urban centers, including early forms of Kish, Uruk, and other expanding cities of southern Mesopotamia. In this interpretation, abandonment is not disappearance, but relocation, a population drawn toward growing hubs of political and economic power. This idea carries a certain logic. Early urbanization rarely happens evenly. It concentrates. Resources, labor, and administration tend to centralize where control is strongest. If Jemdet Nasr communities were part of this process, then their emptying would represent transformation rather than collapse. Still, the archaeological record does not always present a smooth transition. Some settlement layers show abrupt cessation without clear evidence of immediate resettlement elsewhere. Floors remain unburned, walls uncollapsed, and yet no subsequent occupation follows for long periods. It is as if the human presence simply paused. This is where alternative interpretations begin to emerge, carefully phrased, often speculative, and never universally accepted. One suggestion considers episodic environmental stress beyond gradual climate variation, short but severe events such as flooding anomalies, salinization spikes, or sudden shifts in river channels. A settlement dependent on a delicate balance of irrigation could become untenable almost overnight if water routes changed direction or became contaminated with salt-rich deposits. In such a scenario, abandonment would be rapid, but not necessarily chaotic. Another perspective explores the possibility of social or political disruption. The Jemdet Nasr period sits close to the rise of early state formation in Mesopotamia, a time when authority structures were still fluid and competing. Could certain settlements have been deliberately dismantled or depopulated as power consolidated elsewhere? There is no direct evidence of large-scale forced displacement, but the unevenness of abandonment patterns leaves room for interpretation. Then there are more speculative ideas, which sit further from mainstream archaeological consensus, but continue to circulate in broader discussions of ancient urbanism. Some propose that Jemdet Nasr settlements may have been part of experimental phases of urban organization, early attempts at structured living that were periodically reconfigured, relocated, or reorganized as new administrative models emerged. In this view, abandonment is not failure, but iteration. Communities may have been relocated as part of broader planning decisions that left little visible trace in the archaeological record. Others suggest that certain environmental thresholds, once crossed, could have triggered cascading settlement failure across multiple sites simultaneously. If irrigation networks became too saline, or if river courses shifted beyond manageable control, entire clusters of settlements might have been rendered unsustainable in a relatively short span of time. This would create the impression of sudden disappearance, even if the underlying process unfolded over years or decades. Yet even these frameworks do not fully resolve the pattern, because what remains most striking is not just that settlements were abandoned, but that they were not always replaced immediately in the same locations. There are spaces where human activity seems to withdraw, leaving gaps in the inhabited landscape. These gaps are difficult to interpret. Were they ecological recovery zones, shifts in trade routes, or simply the result of population movement that has not yet been fully traced? The material record offers fragments, not continuity. Pottery styles change. Seal impressions evolve. Administrative systems become more complex in later periods. But between these developments lie unanswered intervals, quiet zones in the archaeological timeline where occupation is unclear. Standing at the edge of one of these ancient sites today, what remains is not ruins in the dramatic sense, but impressions, outlines of walls, traces of storage pits, faint indications of daily life interrupted. The soil preserves presence and absence equally, but it does not explain the transition between them. So we are left with a layered uncertainty. Were the Jemdet Nasr settlements abandoned because the environment shifted too quickly to adapt? Were they absorbed into growing urban centers, their identities dissolved into larger political structures? Or were they part of a broader cycle of experimentation in early urban life, where settlement itself was more fluid than we assume? And perhaps the deeper question is not just why they were abandoned, but how many such settlements once existed that we have not yet uncovered at all, their traces erased by time, waiting beneath the same plains that once supported them. As the traces of Jemdet Nasr settlements fade into questions of disappearance and relocation, the narrative does not settle into clarity. Instead, it shifts again, away from abandoned rooms and silent hearths, and toward something far more enduring. Something that did not vanish with the people who once carved it, painted it, or pressed it into clay. A symbol. Across Mesopotamia, from early cylinder seals to monumental reliefs, a recurring image emerges with striking persistence, a powerful composite creature, part lion, part eagle, sometimes described as a lion-headed eagle. Known in later Akkadian tradition as Imdugud, and often associated with the broader figure of Anzu, this being appears suspended in moments of conflict, dominance, or divine encounter. It is not a minor decorative detail. It is repeated, refined, and placed in contexts that suggest importance far beyond artistic preference. On a carved seal impression, the creature might be shown grasping struggling animals in its talons. On temple artifacts, it may be depicted confronting gods or standing as a guardian figure. In later interpretations, it is often linked with storm, power, and the boundary between divine order and chaos. But when we trace its earliest appearances back into the Sumerian world, its meaning becomes less certain, not more. What, exactly, did Imdugud represent to the people who first gave it form? To approach this question, we return once more to the layered landscape of southern Mesopotamia, where cities like Girsu once managed water through intricate canals, and where Jemdet Nasr settlements rose and disappeared in patterns we still struggle to fully explain. In this same cultural environment, where survival depended on balancing nature, administration, and belief, symbols were not passive decorations. They were active elements of meaning. And Imdugud appears again and again. One of the most famous depictions comes from the early dynastic period, particularly in association with the temple precinct of Ningirsu at Girsu. Here, the lion-headed eagle is shown in a dramatic pose, grasping lions in its talons, a visual assertion of dominance over powerful terrestrial forces. In this interpretation, the creature is often understood as a divine emblem connected to Ningirsu himself, or as a mythological representation of the god's power over chaos. But even this explanation does not settle the matter completely, because the motif predates its clearer mythological associations. Early forms appear in contexts that are not fully narrative, where the image seems less like a scene from a story and more like a symbol whose story has not yet been fully articulated. In the absence of a single definitive explanation, scholars turn to comparative mythology and iconography. The lion, in Mesopotamian symbolism, is associated with strength, kingship, and earthly dominance. The eagle, by contrast, belongs to the sky, to height, to vision beyond human reach. When fused into a single being, the result is not simply hybrid, it is layered, almost conceptual. Earth and sky combined, power multiplied, boundaries crossed. Was Imdugud meant to represent the union of opposites, or the dominance of one realm over another? Mainstream interpretations tend to favor a theological reading. In this view, Imdugud is a manifestation of divine authority, a protective force linked to temples and kingship. It may function as a guardian symbol, marking sacred space and asserting control over disorder. In a world where floods, droughts, and shifting rivers could determine survival, such a symbol would carry deep psychological weight. Yet even within this framework, uncertainties remain. Why does the motif appear in such dynamic and violent poses? Why is it so often associated with struggle, grasping, attacking, overpowering, rather than calm protection? And why does it persist across time, evolving in form but not in presence? Some scholars suggest that Imdugud reflects a mythological narrative now only partially preserved. In later Akkadian mythology, Anzu is described as a storm bird that steals the Tablet of Destinies, provoking conflict with divine forces. This story may preserve echoes of earlier Sumerian beliefs, where the lion-headed eagle represented a disruptive or liminal power, something that exists between established categories rather than within them. But the earliest Sumerian layers do not provide a complete version of this story. They provide fragments, images without full textual anchoring, symbols without fully surviving mythological context, and so the imagination fills the gaps. Could Imdugud have been more than myth? Some alternative interpretations, rarely accepted in academic circles but persistent in broader discussions of ancient symbolism, propose that such composite creatures might encode astronomical or environmental observations. The eagle, with its association to the sky, and the lion, tied to terrestrial cycles, could represent seasonal transitions or celestial events interpreted through animal forms. Others suggest that Imdugud may have functioned as a mnemonic symbol within oral traditions now lost, a visual anchor for narratives that were never fully written down. In this reading, the image is not the story itself, but a gateway into a story that required cultural transmission to be fully understood. There are even more speculative perspectives that see composite beings like Imdugud as expressions of early cognitive attempts to map complexity onto recognizable forms. In this view, the lion-headed eagle is not a literal or purely mythological figure, but a symbolic compression of multiple forces: predation, flight, sovereignty, danger, protection, into a single intelligible image. Yet none of these interpretations fully exhaust the symbol's presence, because what remains most striking is its continuity. Across seals, reliefs, and temple artifacts, Imdugud does not fade. It transforms, adapts, reappears in new stylistic forms, but never disappears entirely. It moves through time like an idea that refuses to be resolved. Even when the surrounding world changes, when Jemdet Nasr settlements are abandoned, when Girsu's canals shift or fail, the image persists. It is as if the symbol itself is more stable than the cities that produced it. This raises a quiet but unsettling question. Was Imdugud created to explain the world, or to contain something within it that resisted explanation? Archaeologists studying early cylinder seals note that these images were not merely decorative impressions. They functioned as identifiers, markers of authority, and possibly even as protective or legitimizing devices. When Imdugud appears on such objects, it may have served to embed power into material form, transforming clay into a carrier of symbolic force. But even here, interpretation stops short of certainty. Because unlike written myths that can be translated and compared, symbols operate in a different register. They communicate through repetition, context, and shared cultural understanding, most of which is now partially lost. We can describe what we see, but not always what it meant to those who saw it in its original time. And so Imdugud remains suspended between categories: myth and emblem, story and structure, theology and abstraction. Standing before a carved seal impression today, the image is small, almost fragile. Yet within its compact form lies a fusion of worlds, sky and earth, predator and guardian, chaos and order. A single figure holding contradictions in balance, without resolving them. And perhaps that is where the mystery quietly persists. Because if Imdugud was meant to explain power, why does it so often appear in moments of conflict? If it was meant to protect, why does it so often depict struggle? And if it was only symbolic, why does it feel so deliberately constructed, so insistently present across generations? As we move forward through the remnants of Sumerian civilization, through canals, abandoned settlements, and undeciphered transitions, this image lingers behind them all, like a question carved into clay and never fully answered. What did the lion-headed eagle truly mean to those who first saw it rise from the surface of wet clay? As the image of Imdugud lingers, half symbol, half question etched into clay, the narrative shifts once more, moving from representation back into structure, from iconography into architecture. The questions now no longer rest on seals or tablets, but beneath stone and mud brick, where silence is not symbolic, but physical. We arrive in southern Mesopotamia, at the ancient city of Ur. Here, rising from the flat desert plain, stands the remains of one of the most iconic structures of the Sumerian world, the Great Ziggurat of Ur. Built during the early dynastic period, and later reconstructed under King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC, this massive stepped platform once dominated the skyline. It was not merely a temple, but a layered architectural statement, linking earth to heaven through ascending terraces of mud brick and bitumen. From a distance, it would have appeared almost unnatural against the horizon, a geometric form in a landscape defined by erosion and wind. A man-made elevation reaching upward, as if attempting to bridge something beyond the physical world. But it is what lies beneath this structure that continues to draw quiet attention from archaeology. Beneath the visible terraces and reconstructed stairways, excavations have revealed a complex substructure of chambers, passages, and sealed spaces. Some are clearly functional, supporting the immense weight of the ziggurat above. Others, however, appear more deliberate in their closure, their entrances blocked with mud brick or filled in during early construction phases. These are the sealed rooms beneath the Ziggurat of Ur. At first interpretation, many of these spaces are understood within practical terms. Foundation deposits, ritual offerings placed beneath monumental structures are well documented throughout Mesopotamian architecture. Objects such as figurines, inscribed tablets, and ceremonial items were often buried beneath temples to consecrate the building and secure divine favor. In this view, sealed chambers beneath the ziggurat would serve a sacred but symbolic purpose, hidden spaces designed not to be opened again. Yet the physical arrangement of some of these rooms complicates that explanation. Certain chambers appear not as simple pits for deposits, but as structured spaces with defined boundaries, walls, corners, and in some cases, internal subdivisions. Some entrances are sealed in ways that suggest deliberate closure after construction, not mere abandonment of access points. The question arises, were these rooms ever intended to be entered again? And if not, what exactly was meant to remain inside them? The written record from Ur and surrounding cities provides partial context. Temple inscriptions describe offerings to deities such as Nanna, the moon god, to whom the ziggurat was dedicated. Ritual language emphasizes purity, separation, and the containment of sacred objects. In this worldview, certain spaces were not meant for human re-entry once consecrated. Closure itself was part of the ritual. But texts rarely describe architectural details in full. They tell us why something was done, but not always how it physically manifested. and so archaeology must interpret absence as carefully as presence. Some sealed spaces beneath the ziggurat contain no visible artifacts at all. Others yield only traces, ash layers, fragments of organic material, or small ritual objects placed with apparent intention. The scarcity of material raises its own set of questions. Were these rooms emptied deliberately before sealing? Or were their contents removed in antiquity, leaving only the architectural memory of their existence? There are interpretations that remain firmly within mainstream archaeology, that these chambers functioned as symbolic foundations, ritually sealed to stabilize the structure both physically and spiritually. In ancient Mesopotamian thought, the boundary between engineering and ritual was not sharply drawn. A building was not only constructed, it was activated through ceremony. But even within this framework, not all details align neatly. Some researchers have noted inconsistencies in access patterns and construction phases, suggesting that certain chambers may have been modified or sealed at different times than the main structure. This implies a dynamic building history, where spaces were reinterpreted or repurposed as the ziggurat evolved. Yet the reasons for these changes are not always clear in the archaeological record. And so, alternative perspectives begin to emerge, not as conclusions, but as attempts to account for what standard interpretations leave unresolved. One speculative idea considers the possibility that some sealed rooms functioned as controlled voids, architectural spaces intentionally left inaccessible to create symbolic or structural balance within the monument. In this reading, emptiness itself becomes meaningful. A sealed chamber is not a container, but a deliberate absence, a void embedded within sacred architecture. Another interpretation suggests that certain sealed areas may have served as archival or ritual repositories, storing objects or inscriptions meant to remain hidden from general access, possibly even from later generations of priests. In such a scenario, sealing is not an endpoint, but a form of preservation, an attempt to fix knowledge or power in place beyond human interference. There are also more fringe interpretations, often circulated outside academic consensus, that propose the existence of deliberately concealed chambers intended for highly restricted rituals or knowledge. These ideas draw on broader patterns of ancient architectural secrecy, pointing to other cultures where sacred spaces were permanently sealed after use. However, no direct evidence from Uruk confirms such practices in the specific context of hidden archives or inaccessible sanctuaries beneath the ziggurat. Still, the persistence of sealed architecture invites speculation. Because sealing is not passive, it is an action. It implies intention, closure, and finality. To seal a room beneath a monumental structure is to decide that whatever lies within should remain untouched, possibly indefinitely. And yet, time rarely respects such decisions. As millennia pass, the ziggurat itself erodes, collapses in places, is reconstructed, and studied. Modern excavation reveals layers of construction that were never meant to be seen again. The sealed rooms, once deliberately hidden beneath sacred architecture, become subjects of measurement, mapping, and interpretation. But even with modern archaeology, access is limited. Some chambers remain physically unreachable without risking structural damage to the monument above. Others are only partially exposed, their full dimensions still uncertain. What we know of them is often inferred rather than fully observed. This partial visibility adds another layer to the mystery. We are studying spaces that were designed, in some cases, to resist study. And so the question becomes less about what was placed inside these rooms and more about why the act of sealing was so important in the first place. Was it purely ritual, meant to anchor divine presence into the foundation of the ziggurat? Was it structural, embedding architectural stability into the very idea of closure? Or was it something more complex, a fusion of belief, engineering, and controlled absence that we no longer fully recognize in modern terms. Standing at the base of the reconstructed Ziggurat of Ur today, the structure rises in silent tiers, its massive form carefully restored yet still incomplete in its original meaning. Beneath its visible layers lie the hidden chambers, some mapped, some inferred, some still uncertain in their extent. And beneath those chambers lies another kind of uncertainty, not about stone or clay, but about intention. What did it mean in the Sumerian world to create a space and then seal it forever beneath a temple meant to connect earth and heaven? And how many such spaces still remain unnoticed beneath the monuments we believe we already understand? As the sealed chambers beneath the Ziggurat of Ur fade into silence, spaces defined as much by what is absent as what is present, the exploration moves once again outward across the southern Mesopotamian plain. From foundations buried beneath sacred architecture, the narrative turns toward something more elusive still, a center of worship that seems to have receded from both the landscape and the historical record. We move toward the legacy of the goddess Nanshe. In the Sumerian world, Nanshe was associated with water, justice, dreams, and interpretation of omens. She was not a distant deity of abstraction, but one deeply embedded in the ethical and environmental fabric of early city-states. Her influence is most closely tied to the region of Lagash, where texts describe her as a divine judge of truth and protector of the vulnerable. In hymns and administrative inscriptions, she appears as a figure who oversees fairness in trade, ensures the integrity of measures, and interprets the hidden meanings of dreams. And yet, despite this detailed literary presence, the physical location of her primary cult center remains surprisingly uncertain. Unlike major temple complexes dedicated to other deities in Mesopotamia, which have been identified, excavated, or at least tentatively mapped, the central religious heart associated with Nanshe resists clear archaeological definition. References in inscriptions point to temples, shrines, and ritual spaces connected to her worship, particularly within the broader Lagash state during the early dynastic period, around 2600 to 2300 BC. But the expected monumental footprint of a major goddess, one who appears prominently in texts, does not align neatly with the material remains uncovered so far. What happened to her central sanctuary? Some scholars suggest that the answer lies in the shifting geography of Mesopotamian cities. Rivers changed course, political centers moved, temples were rebuilt, renamed or absorbed into larger religious complexes dedicated to more dominant deities, such as Ningirsu or Eanna. In this interpretation, the religious center of Nanshe did not disappear. It was gradually integrated, its identity dispersed across successive phases of urban transformation. But even within this framework, gaps remain. Certain administrative tablets from Lagash mention offerings and personnel dedicated specifically to Nanshe, indicating an organized cult structure with resources and institutional support. Ritual specialists, scribes, and labor allocations are recorded with precision. This suggests not a marginal cult, but a functioning religious system with defined infrastructure. And yet, the physical counterpart of this system has not been clearly isolated in the archaeological record. There are temple remains in the region of Tel Zurgal, often associated with ancient Nigan, which some researchers link to the worship of Nanshe. Excavations there have revealed a long history of occupation and religious construction, including mud brick platforms and ceremonial deposits. It is widely considered a strong candidate for her cult center. However, the evidence is layered across multiple periods, and attribution to Nanshe is often reconstructed through indirect textual association rather than definitive architectural labeling. This leaves room for uncertainty. Was Nanshe's primary sanctuary truly located here, gradually transformed over centuries until its original identity became indistinct? Or was her cult center something more fluid, distributed across multiple sites rather than concentrated in a single monumental complex? Some interpretations propose that Nanshe's worship may have been deliberately decentralized, reflecting her association with water systems and liminal spaces. Unlike deities tied to a single city or temple, her influence may have been embedded within a network of smaller shrines, canal-side sanctuaries, and local ritual spaces. In this view, the absence of a singular grand temple is not a loss, but a structural feature of her cult. Yet this idea raises further questions. In a culture that often expressed divine authority through monumental architecture, why would a major goddess lack a clearly defined central sanctuary? Was her worship intentionally diffuse, or has the archaeological signature of her primary center simply not survived the erosion of time and riverine change? There are also more speculative perspectives that occasionally emerge at the margins of discussion. Some suggest that the apparent disappearance of a central Nanshe temple may reflect later religious restructuring, where older cult centers were repurposed, dismantled, or reattributed under shifting theological systems. In such a scenario, the physical remnants of her primary sanctuary could exist beneath later constructions, unrecognized due to continuous rebuilding. Others consider whether the very nature of her divine role, associated with dreams, judgment, and hidden knowledge, may have influenced how her worship spaces were designed. Could it be that her most significant rituals were conducted in spaces that left minimal architectural traces, emphasizing symbolic or temporary structures rather than enduring stone and brick? These ideas remain speculative, yet they highlight an important tension in the archaeological record: the difference between textual prominence and material visibility. Nanshe is present in the written world of Sumer with remarkable clarity. She speaks through hymns, administrative records, and mythic references. She appears as a moral force, a divine overseer of truth and justice. And yet, when we attempt to locate the physical heart of her worship, the ground offers only fragments, suggestions, and partial alignments. It is as if her presence is more stable in language than in landscape. Standing amid the ruins associated with ancient Lagash and its surrounding settlements, one is confronted not with absence, but with incompleteness. Foundations remain. Pottery shards surface from the soil. Inscribed tablets preserve her name. But the defining center, if it once existed in a singular form, remains elusive. And so the question lingers quietly in the background of the archaeological record. Was the missing religious center of Nanshe lost to time through destruction, transformation, or simple dispersal across a shifting urban landscape? Or has it survived in a form we have not yet fully recognized, hidden not beneath monumental ruins, but within a network of smaller, quieter spaces that have yet to reveal their full significance? As the search for Nanshe's elusive center fades into uncertainty, her presence clearer in texts than in stone, the focus shifts once more, away from temples and sacred landscapes, and back into the most intimate setting of ancient Sumerian life: the home. Across the archaeological sites of southern Mesopotamia, places like Eridu, and Kish, excavations reveal dense layers of domestic architecture. Mud brick houses clustered along narrow streets, courtyards enclosed by simple walls, ovens built into corners where daily life unfolded with quiet repetition. These were not monumental spaces. They were lived-in environments, shaped by routine rather than ceremony. And yet, beneath many of these ordinary houses, archaeologists have uncovered something unexpected: burials. Human remains placed not in distant cemeteries, but directly beneath domestic floors. At first glance, this practice might seem unusual from a modern perspective, where separation between the living and the dead is more sharply defined. But in the Sumerian world, especially during the early dynastic period around 2900 to 2300 BC, burial within or beneath homes was not uncommon. Infants, children, and sometimes adults were interred beneath floors, courtyards, or near thresholds. These were not isolated occurrences. They appear across multiple sites, suggesting a cultural pattern rather than an anomaly. But the details of these burials often raise deeper questions. Some individuals were placed in simple pits, wrapped in mats, or placed within ceramic vessels. Others were interred with grave goods, pottery, personal ornaments, or small objects that may have held symbolic significance. In certain cases, bodies appear to have been carefully positioned, as if arranged with deliberate intention rather than hastily deposited. And then there are the burials that resist easy interpretation. Graves located beneath high-traffic areas of the home. Interments that seem spatially integrated into the architecture itself, as if the house was constructed around them or maintained in relation to them. In some instances, multiple burials occur beneath a single dwelling over time, suggesting a continuity of association between the living space and the dead. Why would the boundary between life and death be placed so close? Mainstream archaeological interpretation often points toward ancestor veneration. In this view, burying the dead beneath the home was a way of maintaining proximity to family lineage. The deceased remained part of the household, their presence symbolically integrated into daily life. Offerings could be made, memory preserved, the house itself becoming a kind of extended family structure where generations remained physically and spiritually connected. This interpretation aligns with broader Mesopotamian beliefs about the afterlife, which often emphasized a shadowy continuation of existence rather than reward or punishment. The dead were not removed from the world entirely. They remained in a diminished but ongoing relationship with the living. But even within this framework, certain details remain difficult to fully explain. Some burials appear to lack the typical markers of family status or ritual care. Others are placed in locations that seem structurally inconvenient or symbolically ambiguous. In a few cases, skeletal remains show signs that invite further questions about cause of death or treatment before burial, though preservation conditions make definitive conclusions difficult. These inconsistencies open the door to broader interpretations. One perspective suggests that such burials may have served protective functions. The presence of the dead beneath a house could have been intended to anchor the structure spiritually, providing stability or safeguarding against misfortune. In this reading, the burial is not only about remembrance, but about active influence, ensuring that the house remains under watchful protection. Another interpretation considers the possibility that certain burials marked ownership or legal continuity. In societies where property, inheritance, and household identity were deeply interconnected, placing a burial beneath a home could symbolically bind a family lineage to a specific space across generations. There are also more speculative ideas, which remain outside mainstream consensus, but continue to surface in broader discussions of ancient domestic ritual. Some suggest that certain underfloor burials may reflect practices of household foundation rites, where human remains were incorporated into the physical and symbolic grounding of a new dwelling. In this view, the house is not simply built on the earth. It is ritually connected to it through the presence of the dead. Others propose that variations in burial type and placement might reflect shifting beliefs over time, or even differences between social groups, occupations, or local traditions that have not yet been fully distinguished in the archaeological record. Yet what remains consistent across these interpretations is the absence of a single, unified explanation that accounts for every case. Because beneath the same architectural pattern, mud brick homes built around courtyards and hearths, there exists a diversity of burial practices that resist simple categorization. Some are intimate, some are ambiguous, some feel integrated into domestic life in ways that are still not fully understood. And so the question becomes not only why the dead were placed beneath the living, but how the living understood that proximity. Did these households perceive the boundary between life and death as permeable, with the home functioning as a shared space across generations? Or were these burials expressions of more complex social, legal, or ritual systems that modern categories can only partially capture? Standing above these ancient houses today, the ground reveals little at first glance. Walls have collapsed, floors have eroded, streets are reduced to outlines in soil. Yet beneath those layers, human remains still trace the contours of domestic life, silent, embedded, and persistent. And as excavation continues, one thought lingers beneath the surface of interpretation itself. How many more stories of daily life, family, and memory remain sealed beneath the homes of ancient Sumer, waiting just beyond reach, beneath the places where life once quietly unfolded?